Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The howl that pierced the night wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote. Hell, it wasn't like any animal I knew, and in my 15 years as a forest ranger, I thought I'd heard them all. I jolted awake, my heart racing. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:17 a.m. Another howl echoed through the darkness, closer this time. I threw off the covers and fumbled for my flashlight, nearly knocking it off the bedside table in my haste. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way to the window. I pulled back the curtain, peering out into the inky blackness. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting barely enough light to make out the tree line at the edge of the clearing where my cabin stood. I should have left it alone. Should have crawled back into bed, pulled the covers over my head, and pretended I hadn't heard a thing. But curiosity got the better of me. It always did. I threw on my jacket and laced up my boots. The metal of my rifle was cold against my palm as I grabbed it from its rack by the door. Probably wouldn't need it, but better safe than sorry. The night air hit me like a slap to the face as I stepped outside. It was unseasonably cold for early autumn, my breath forming little clouds in front of me. I clicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the yard. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual. My beat-up pickup truck, the woodpile stacked neatly against the side of the cabin, the rusted wheelbarrow I kept meaning to fix. Another howl split the air, definitely closer now. It came from the woods to the north. I hesitated for a moment, then started walking. The tall grass was wet with dew, soaking through my jeans as I made my way to the tree line. The forest loomed before me, a wall of darkness. I'd spent countless hours in these woods, knew them like the back of my hand. But at night, everything was different. The familiar became strange, shadows playing tricks on the eyes. I swept my flashlight back and forth as I entered the trees. The beam caught the gleam of eyes here and there, probably raccoons or possums. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something bigger. The underbrush was thick, grabbing at my clothes as I pushed through. Branches snapped under my feet, sounding impossibly loud in the quiet of the night. I winced at each crack, feeling like I was announcing my presence to whatever was out there. After about 10 minutes of walking, I came to a small clearing, and there in the soft earth I saw them, footprints, but not like any I'd seen before. I crouched down, shining my light on the tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my hand, 5 toes like a bear, but the shape was all wrong, too elongated, almost human-like, and the claws. I'd never seen claw marks that deep. A twig snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. The beam of my flashlight danced wildly across the trees, but I saw nothing. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small and scared, even to my own ears. Silence answered me, but it was a heavy silence, pregnant with something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned back to the tracks, trying to follow their path with my eyes. They led deeper into the woods, towards the mountains. Part of me wanted to follow them, to solve this mystery, but a larger part, the part that had kept me alive all these years, screamed at me to turn back. As I stood there, debating my next move, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, a shadow passing between trees. But it was big, much bigger than any animal that should be in these woods. My breath caught in my throat. I raised my rifle, pointing it in the direction of the movement. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the beam of the flashlight steady. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "This is Ranger Mike Hawkins. Identify yourself." Another snap of a branch, this time to my left. I spun, my finger tightening on the trigger of my rifle. But there was nothing there. Just more trees, more darkness. And then I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion. It was something else. Something that sent chills racing down my spine and made my legs go weak. I backed up slowly, my eyes darting from tree to tree. The growl grew louder, and I could swear I saw something moving in the shadows. Something big. That's when I ran. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I faced whatever it was with courage. But the truth is, pure animal terror took over. I turned and sprinted back the way I'd come, branches whipping my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush. It was fast, much faster than it should be for its size. The sound of its pursuit drove me on, my lungs burning, my legs pumping harder than they ever had before. I burst out of the tree line, not daring to look back. My cabin was there, a beacon of safety in the night. I reached the porch in record time, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the door open. I slammed the door behind me, throwing the deadbolt and leaning against it, gasping for breath. For a long moment, the only sound was my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then, from just outside, I heard a snuffle, like something big was sniffing at the base of the door. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wood, willing whatever it was to go away. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Finally, I heard heavy footsteps moving away from the cabin. I slid down to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me. I sat there until dawn, my rifle clutched to my chest, jumping at every sound. When the first rays of sunlight peeked through the windows, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. There, in the soft earth of my front yard, were tracks, the same huge humanoid prints I'd seen in the woods. They circled the cabin before heading back into the forest. I've been a ranger for a long time. I've seen bears, mountain lions, all manner of wildlife. But this was something different, something that shouldn't exist. I reported the incident, of course, but I left out the part about the humanoid tracks. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy or worse, drunk on the job. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and every night since then, when I hear a howl in the distance or a branch snap outside my window, I wonder, is it back? Is it watching me? And most of all, what exactly is out there in the woods? I've started looking into local legends, old stories about creatures in these mountains, and I've found some things that make me think maybe, just maybe, there's more out there than we know. But one thing's for sure, I don't go into the woods at night anymore, and neither should you. Story 2, the stench hit us like a wall, rancid and overpowering. It was the unmistakable odor of death, and it was coming from somewhere far too close to our campsite. We'd been looking forward to this camping trip for months. Just me, my wife Sarah, and our dog Max, getting away from the city for a long weekend in the wilderness. But as the putrid smell wafted through our campsite, I knew our peaceful getaway was about to take a dark turn. "Mike, what is that?" Sarah asked, her nose wrinkling in disgust. I tried to keep my voice calm, not wanting to alarm her. Probably just a dead animal nearby. "I'll go check it out." I grabbed my hunting knife and flashlight, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Max whined, clearly agitated by the smell. I patted his head reassuringly before heading into the underbrush. The odor grew stronger as I pushed through the dense foliage. Branches scratched at my arms, and the beam of my flashlight cut through the growing darkness. The sun was setting fast, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me like grasping fingers. After about 50 yards, I found the source of the smell. In a small clearing lay the remains of what I guessed was a deer, or at least part of a deer. Its hindquarters were completely gone, and what was left of its torso had been torn open, ribs exposed to the air. But it wasn't the gore that made my blood run cold. It was the way the carcass had been treated. This wasn't the clean kill of a mountain lion or bear. The animal had been ripped apart, almost played with. Chunks of flesh were scattered around the clearing, as if whatever had done this had been enjoying itself. I'd been hunting since I was a kid, and I'd never seen anything like this. What kind of predator would do this? And more importantly, Was it still nearby? A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there, just the encroaching darkness of the forest. I hurried back to our campsite, my mind racing. Should we pack up and leave? It was getting dark fast, and the idea of driving down the mountain at night wasn't appealing. But staying here, with whatever had done that to the deer possibly lurking nearby. Sarah saw the look on my face as I emerged from the trees. "Mike, what is it? What did you find?" I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what I'd seen. Her eyes widened with fear, and I could see her glancing nervously at the darkening woods around us. "We should leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, already moving to start packing up our gear. "Yeah, I think you're right. Let's get out of here." But as I reached for the tent stakes, a long, low howl echoed through the trees. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was deeper, almost guttural, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Max started barking frantically, the hair on his back standing straight up. Sarah grabbed him, trying to quiet him down, but the fear in her eyes matched my own. "On second thought," I said, my mouth dry, "maybe we should wait until morning. Whatever that is, I don't want to run into it in the dark." Sarah nodded, clutching Max close to her. We retreated to our tent, zipping it up tight, as if the thin fabric could offer any real protection. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The normal chirps of crickets and hoots of owls were there, but underneath it all was something else. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, in a way that spoke of something large moving through the underbrush. We lay there in the darkness, barely breathing, straining our ears for any sign of danger. Sarah's hand found mine, squeezing it tightly. Even Max was quiet, his ears perked up, listening. Then we heard it, a deep, rumbling growl, so close it could have been right outside our tent. Sarah stifled a gasp, and I felt my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The sound of heavy footsteps circled our campsite, once, twice, 3 times. Each circuit brought the steps closer to our tent. I could hear sniffing, like it was trying to catch our scent. I reached for my hunting knife with trembling hands, knowing it would be useless against whatever was out there, but needing to feel like I could do something, anything, to protect us. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a low, huffing breath, so close I could almost feel it through the tent wall. Sarah was shaking beside me, silent tears streaming down her face. Max let out a low whine, and I quickly shushed him, terrified of drawing attention, but it was too late. A massive shadow fell across our tent, backlit by the dying embers of our campfire. Whatever it was huge. I could make out a vaguely humanoid shape, but much too large to be a person. And were those antlers? The shadow moved, and suddenly claws ripped through the side of our tent like it was paper. Sarah screamed, and all hell broke loose. I don't remember much of what happened next. It's all a blur of terrified shouting, Max barking furiously, and the sound of our tent being torn to shreds. I remember the glint of red eyes in the darkness, the flash of teeth far too large to belong to any normal predator. Somehow, we made it to the car. I have a vague memory of half-carrying, half-dragging Sarah, of Max running ahead of us, barking at whatever was behind us. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the accelerator to the floor, not even bothering to turn on the headlights as we tore down the mountain road. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something enormous loping after us, keeping pace far longer than should have been possible. But eventually, it fell behind, and the dark woods swallowed it up. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, pulling into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. We sat there for a long time, engine idling, too shocked to speak. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. What was that thing? I shook my head, my mouth dry. I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. We reported the incident to the local sheriff's department, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't believe us. They probably thought we were drunk or high, imagining things in the dark, but I know what I saw, what I heard, the image of those red eyes, the sound of that inhuman growl. They're burned into my memory. We don't go camping anymore. The thought of sleeping in a tent, exposed and vulnerable, sends shivers down my spine. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind is howling, I think I can hear that growl again, can see those eyes glowing in the shadows. I've started researching, looking into local legends and folklore. I've found stories, old tales of creatures that roam the wilderness, hunting the unwary. Most people dismiss them as campfire stories, meant to scare kids. But I know better now. I know that there are things out there in the dark, things that defy explanation. And I know that the next time I hear something moving outside my window at night, it might not just be the wind. So if you're planning a camping trip, take my advice. Stay alert, be aware of your surroundings. And if you smell something rotten on the wind, if you hear something moving in the darkness that sounds too big to be natural, don't investigate. Pack up your things and get out of there as fast as you can, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the light of your campfire, waiting for its chance to strike. Story 3. I've been a wildlife photographer for over 2 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for what I captured through my lens that day. It was supposed to be a routine shoot. Track some local black bears, get a few good shots, and head home. Instead, I found myself staring at something that shouldn't exist, something that has haunted my dreams ever since. The morning started like any other. I woke before dawn, packed my gear, and drove out to the remote wilderness area where I'd been tipped off about increased bear activity. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as I hiked deep into the forest. My camera equipment a familiar weight on my back. I'd been walking for about 3 hours when I first spotted the bear. It was a massive specimen, easily one of the largest black bears I'd ever seen. I set up my tripod, adjusted my telephoto lens, and started snapping away. At first, everything seemed normal. The bear was foraging, occasionally lifting its head to sniff the air. But as I zoomed in to capture some close-ups of its face, I noticed something off. The proportions weren't quite right. The snout seemed too elongated, the eyes set at an odd angle. I chalked it up to a trick of the light and kept shooting. It wasn't until I got home and started reviewing the photos that I realized just how wrong I'd been. As I scrolled through the images on my computer screen, my blood ran cold. What I'd thought was a bear in the forest was something else entirely. The creature in my photos had the general shape of a bear, yes, but that's where the similarities ended. Its fur was patchy and matted, revealing leathery skin underneath. The face was a nightmarish blend of ursine and something almost human-like. And the eyes, God, the eyes. They held an intelligence that no bear should possess, a cunning that sent shivers down my spine. I spent hours poring over the images, alternating between fascination and fear. What was this thing? Some kind of mutant bear? A new species? Or something else entirely? Something science couldn't explain? I knew I should alert the authorities, tell someone about what I'd found, but who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of every scientific institution in the country. No, I needed more evidence. I needed to go back. The locals warned me against it. Strange things happen in those woods. The old man at the general store told me, his rheumy eyes serious. Best leave well enough alone. But I couldn't. The mystery of what I'd seen consumed me. I had to know more. So here I am, a week later, hiking back into those same woods. My pack is heavier this time, loaded down with additional camera gear, including a night vision setup. I'm prepared to stay for several days if necessary. The forest seems different this time, quieter. The usual chorus of birdsong is muted, as if the wildlife is holding its breath. Every snapping twig makes me jump. Every shadow in my peripheral vision could be the creature. I set up camp near where I'd taken the original photos, my tent a flimsy barrier against the encroaching wilderness. As night falls, I ready my equipment. The plan is to use motion-activated cameras to capture any nocturnal activity. If the creature is out there, I'll find it. The first night passes uneventfully. I review the footage in the morning, but there's nothing unusual, just the typical nighttime forest dwellers. Disappointed but not discouraged, I spend the day scouting the area, looking for signs of my quarry. It's on the second night that things take a turn. I'm jolted awake by a sound unlike anything I've ever heard, a low, rumbling growl that seems to vibrate through the very ground. It's close, too close. Heart pounding, I grab my camera and night vision goggles, unzipping the tent as quietly as possible. The forest is bathed in an eerie green glow through the goggles, shadows taking on monstrous shapes in the darkness, and then I see it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by a massive pine, is the creature from my photographs. In person, it's even more terrifying. It must be 9 feet tall, its muscular frame a grotesque parody of both bear and man. Its head swivels, nostrils flaring as it scents the air. My hands shake as I raise the camera, trying to steady it enough to get a clear shot. Just as I'm about to press the shutter, the creature's head snaps in my direction. Our eyes meet through the lens, and in that moment, I know it sees me. What happens next is a blur of terror and adrenaline. The creature charges, moving with a speed that belies its size. I drop the camera, my instincts screaming at me to run. I burst out of the tent, abandoning all my gear in my desperation to escape. I crash through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I can hear it behind me, the sound of its pursuit like a freight train in the quiet forest. My lungs burn, my legs ache, but fear pushes me onward. I don't know how long I run. Time loses all meaning in the face of blind panic. Eventually, I burst out onto a road, the same one I'd driven in on days ago. By some miracle, my car is there, and I fumble with the keys, my hands slick with sweat and blood from dozens of small cuts. The engine roars to life just as a massive shape emerges from the tree line. I catch a glimpse of glowing eyes and bared teeth in my rearview mirror as I floor the accelerator, tires squealing on the asphalt. I drive through the night, not stopping until I'm back in the city, surrounded by the comforting glow of streetlights and the buzz of civilization. Only then do I allow myself to break down, the full weight of what I've experienced crashing over me like a wave. In the days that follow, I grapple with what to do. My tent and most of my equipment are still out there in the woods, but I can't bring myself to go back for them. The few photos I managed to save on my camera's memory card are tantalizing but inconclusive. Strange shadows and blurred movement that could be explained away by skeptics. I consider going public with what I've seen, but I know how it would sound. I'd be branded a lunatic, my reputation as a serious wildlife photographer ruined. And yet, the thought of staying silent, of letting whatever that thing was remain undiscovered, feels like a betrayal of everything I stand for as a documentarian of nature. In the end, I make a compromise with myself. I'll continue my research quietly, gathering more evidence before I even think about going public. I scour the internet for similar sightings, reach out to cryptozoology forums, something I never thought I'd do, and plan my next expedition. Because I know it's out there. I've looked into its eyes, seen the intelligence and the hunger there, and I know it's not alone. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our understanding, and I'm going to find them, no matter the cost. So if you're ever in the deep woods, and you hear something moving in the underbrush that sounds too big, too purposeful to be any normal animal, remember my story. Remember that there are things out there that we can't explain, things that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world, and whatever you do, don't try to take its picture. Some mysteries are better left uncaptured. Story 4. The cave mouth gaped before us like a wound in the mountainside, dark and forbidding. We'd come looking for deer, but what we found in those depths would haunt us for the rest of our lives. It was supposed to be a routine hunting trip, just me, my brother Tom, and our old friend Mike spending a long weekend in the mountains like we'd done every fall for the past decade. We were experienced outdoorsmen, confident in our abilities to handle whatever nature threw our way, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered in that cave. The day started normally enough. We'd been tracking a promising buck since dawn, following its trail deeper into the wilderness than we'd ever gone before. The terrain was rough, all steep inclines and dense underbrush, but the promise of a trophy kill kept us pushing forward. It was late afternoon when we stumbled upon the cave. We probably would have missed it entirely if Tom hadn't needed to take a leak. He wandered off behind some boulders and came back with wide eyes. "Guys, you've got to see this," he said, gesturing for us to follow. The cave entrance was partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, but once we pushed through, we found ourselves staring into a yawning darkness that seemed to swallow all light. Mike let out a low whistle. "That's something you don't see every day." I nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. As the de facto leader of our little group, I knew the others were waiting for me to make a decision. "Should we check it out?" Tom asked, already reaching for his flashlight. I hesitated. The smart move would be to mark the location on our GPS and come back another time, properly equipped for cave exploration. But curiosity got the better of me. "Yeah, let's take a quick look," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But we don't go too deep, all right? Just a quick peek." We clicked on our flashlights and stepped into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was something off about this place, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The beam of my flashlight swept across the cave walls, revealing strange markings. At first, I thought they were just natural formations in the rock, but as we moved deeper, I realized they were claw marks, deep, parallel grooves that looked like they'd been made by something massive. "Jesus," Mike muttered, running his hand along one of the marks. "What do you think made these?" "Bear, maybe," Tom suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. "I've never seen bear marks like this. These are bigger." We pressed on, the cave narrowing as we went. The floor was littered with bones, which crunched unsettlingly under our boots. Most seemed to be from deer or elk, but some were larger, shapes I couldn't quite identify in the dim light. The air grew thicker the deeper we went, heavy with the stench of decay. We should have turned back then, but a morbid fascination drove us forward. What kind of creature could have done this? After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the tunnel opened up into a large cavern. Our flashlights couldn't penetrate the darkness fully, the beams swallowed by the vast space. "Look," Tom said, pointing to one side of the cavern. Our lights revealed a pile of bones larger than any we'd seen so far. But it wasn't the size that made my blood run cold. It was the organization. The bones weren't scattered randomly. They'd been arranged in a deliberate pattern, almost like, "Is that a nest?" Mike's voice was barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, a low growl echoed through the cavern. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, deep, guttural, and undeniably menacing. We froze, our flashlights darting around frantically. In the far corner of the cavern, two eyes reflected the light, glowing an eerie red. "Run," I managed to croak out, my mouth dry with fear. We turned and bolted, stumbling over rocks and bones in our haste to escape. The growl turned into a roar that shook the very walls of the cave, and I could hear something massive moving behind us. I didn't dare look back, focusing all my energy on putting one foot in front of the other. The sound of heavy footfalls echoed off the cave walls, getting closer with each passing second. We burst out of the cave entrance, gasping for air, but we didn't stop running. We crashed through the underbrush, abandoning any pretense of stealth or tracking. It wasn't until we reached our campsite, a good mile from the cave, that we finally stopped. We stood there, bent over and panting, trying to process what had just happened. What the hell was that thing?" Tom gasped out between breaths. I shook my head, still struggling to believe what I'd seen. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here, now." We packed up camp in record time, constantly glancing over our shoulders, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. The hike back to our truck was tense, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were safely on the road, putting miles between us and that godforsaken cave, that we started to talk about it. Maybe it was a bear, Mike suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. A really big bear. Tom shook his head. Did you see those claw marks? No bear could make those. And that roar. That wasn't any animal I've ever heard. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. Whatever it was, it shouldn't exist. Things like that, they're not supposed to be real. We fell into silence again, each lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing red eyes, the deliberate arrangement of bones. Whatever was in that cave, it wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent, and that terrified me more than anything. When we got back to town, we debated whether to report what we'd seen, but who would believe us? We'd sound like lunatics, 3 grown men spinning yarns about monsters in caves. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves, at least until we could figure out what to do. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've been obsessed with trying to understand what we encountered. I've pored over local legends, delved into cryptozoology forums, even reached out to a few experts in wildlife biology, but nothing quite matches what we saw. There have been reports, though. Hikers gone missing in that area, livestock found torn apart in nearby farms. The locals whisper about an old legend, a creature that's lived in those mountains for centuries, emerging to hunt when food grows scarce. I can't stop thinking about it, about what's out there, lurking in the darkness. I know I should let it go, try to forget what we saw, but I can't, because I know it's real. I know it's out there. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that roar echoing across the miles. A reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. So if you're ever out in the wilderness and you come across a cave that seems just a little too dark, a little too quiet, remember our story. Remember that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and that sometimes the unknown is best left unexplored. Because in the depths of that mountain, something ancient and terrible is waiting, and it's hungry. Story 5. The moment I saw those eyes glowing in the darkness, I knew we had made a terrible mistake. What had started as an exciting night hike through the forest had quickly turned into a nightmare, and now we were being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. It was supposed to be a fun adventure, a way to cap off our annual camping trip. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Alex, his girlfriend Sarah, and our college buddies Mike and Tom. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the city and spend a week in the wilderness. The first few days had been great. We hiked, fished, and sat around the campfire telling stories and laughing. But by the 5th day, we were getting restless. That's when Alex suggested the night hike. "Auntie, come on, guys," he said, his eyes glinting with excitement. "We've got our headlamps. It'll be an adventure." We should have known better. We were experienced campers, aware of the dangers that come with wandering the woods after dark. But the thrill of doing something a little risky, combined with the false sense of security that comes from being in a group, overrode our common sense. So as the sun began to set, we geared up. Headlamps on 2, water bottles filled, and a general sense of excitement in the air. We even brought along some snacks, planning to find a nice clearing to sit and stargaze. The forest was different at night. The familiar trails we had been hiking all week suddenly seemed alien in the darkness. Shadows danced at the edge of our light beams, and every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us jump. At first, it was exhilarating. We spoke in hushed voices, our words carried away by the gentle night breeze. The forest canopy above us was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business. We had been walking for about an hour when we first noticed something was off. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No chirping insects, no hooting owls. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. "Guys," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Do you hear that? We all stopped, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing, then faintly I caught it, a sound like heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, and it was coming from behind us. "It's probably just a deer," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. We picked up our pace, no longer enjoying the night hike. The sounds behind us grew louder, more deliberate. Whatever was following us, it wasn't trying to hide its presence anymore. That's when we saw the eyes, two pinpricks of light reflecting our headlamps back at us. They were set too high to be a normal animal, and too close together to be a bear. "Run," I heard myself say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. We took off, all pretense of calm abandoned. Branches whipped at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush, our headlamp beams bouncing wildly in the darkness. I could hear the others panting heavily, feet pounding the earth as we fled from whatever was pursuing us. The thing behind us was fast, much faster than it should have been, given its apparent size. I could hear it gaining on us, branches snapping and undergrowth being crushed under its weight. "This way!" Alex yelled, veering off the trail. We followed blindly, too scared to do anything but run. Suddenly, my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, my headlamp flying off and disappearing into the darkness. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet, limping as fast as I could. "Help!" I called out, panic rising in my throat. A hand grabbed my arm, pulling me along. It was Tom. "Come on, man. We've got to keep moving." We stumbled through the forest, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. My lungs were burning, each breath feeling like fire in my chest. But fear kept me going, the primal terror of being prey driving me forward. Suddenly, we burst into a clearing. The others were there, their headlamps illuminating a scene straight out of a nightmare. We were at the edge of a cliff, a sheer drop-off that disappeared into inky blackness. "What do we do?" Sarah cried, her voice verging on hysteria. Before anyone could answer, a massive shape emerged from the tree line. In the feeble light of our remaining headlamps, I caught glimpses of matted fur, impossibly long limbs, and those glowing eyes that had first alerted us to its presence. It moved with an unnatural gait, almost like a man, but not quite. As it stepped into the clearing, I felt my heart skip a beat. It was easily 8 feet tall, its body a grotesque blend of human and animal features. We backed up, pressing ourselves against the cliff edge. There was nowhere left to run. The creature let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. It took another step forward, and that's when our luck changed. With a loud crack, the ground beneath the monster's feet began to crumble. It let out a startled roar as the earth gave way, sending it tumbling over the cliff edge and into the darkness below. For a long moment, we stood frozen, unable to believe what had just happened. Then, as if snapped out of a trance, we all started talking at once. "What was that thing? Did you see how big it was? We need to get out of here." Now, we made our way back to camp in a daze, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment the creature would reappear. It wasn't until we were safely back in our tents that we allowed ourselves to break down, the full weight of what we'd experienced crashing over us. The next morning, we packed up and left, cutting our trip short by 2 days. None of us wanted to spend another night in those woods. In the weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We scoured the internet for similar stories, delved into local legends, even considered reporting our experience to the authorities. But in the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. Who would believe us? Sometimes, late at night, I find myself reliving that chase through the dark forest. I can still hear the creature's growl, still see those glowing eyes in the darkness. And I wonder, what if it survived the fall? What if it's still out there, roaming the wilderness, waiting for its next prey? I don't go camping anymore. The thought of being in the woods after dark sends shivers down my spine. But I know the truth now. I know that there are things out there, things that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist but do. So if you're ever in the forest at night, and you hear something moving in the darkness, something too big to be any normal animal, remember our story. Remember that not all monsters are myths, and that sometimes the oldest legends have a kernel of truth. And whatever you do, don't go towards those glowing eyes in the dark. Run as fast as you can, and pray that it's not faster. Because out there in the wilderness, in the places where civilization's light doesn't reach, the old fears still have teeth, and they're hungry. Story 6. The first time I saw the mangled remains of one of my sheep, I told myself it was just a wolf. By the third attack, I knew I was dealing with something far worse, something that shouldn't exist in this world. My name's John Mackenzie, and I've been running this sheep farm for nigh on 30 years now. It's not an easy life, but it's a good one, or at least it was, until the attack started. It began about a month ago. I was out doing my morning rounds when I found her, one of my best ewes, torn to pieces. At first, I thought it might have been dogs. We've had problems with strays before, but the savagery of the attack, the way the poor creature had been ripped apart, it didn't sit right. I called animal control, but they were as baffled as I was. Could be a bear, the officer suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Bears aren't common in these parts, and even if they were, this didn't look like bear work. A week later, it happened again. 2 more sheep, killed in the same brutal fashion. That's when the rumors started. Old Tom from the next farm over came by, his face grave. "You heard about the Henderson place?" he asked, leaning on my fence. "They lost half their herd last month. Saw something big moving in the woods," they said. "Something that walked on 2 legs. I brushed it off at the time. Superstitious nonsense, I thought. But as the attacks continued, doubt began to creep in. After the 3rd incident, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up trail cameras around the pasture, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was terrorizing my flock. Part of me didn't want to see, didn't want to know what kind of creature could do this, but I had to protect my livelihood. For days, the cameras caught nothing but ordinary wildlife, deer, raccoons, the occasional fox. I was beginning to think the whole thing had been a fluke. Maybe a pack of coyotes that had moved on. Then came the night that changed everything. I was up late, reviewing the day's footage on my laptop. Most of it was the usual, sheep grazing, birds flitting about. But around 2 a.m., something triggered one of the cameras. At first, all I could see was a dark shape moving at the edge of the frame. It was big, much bigger than a wolf or a bear. As it moved into view, I felt my blood run cold. The creature was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It walked on 2 legs, but its body was covered in thick, matted fur. Its arms were long, ending in hands tipped with vicious claws, but it was the face that truly terrified me, a twisted mix of wolf and human features, with eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in the camera's infrared light. I watched, horrified, as it loped across the field with impossible speed and grace. It reached the flock in seconds, scattering the terrified sheep. What happened next? I can hardly bear to describe it. The creature's savagery was beyond anything I'd ever witnessed. When it was over, the beast turned and looked directly at the camera. For a moment, I could swear it knew it was being watched. Then, with one powerful leap, it vanished into the darkness. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to believe it was a hoax, some kid in a costume playing a sick prank. But deep down, I knew. This was real, and it was far from over. The next morning, I drove into town and bought every type of security equipment I could find. More cameras, motion-activated floodlights, even an electric fence. I wasn't taking any chances. As I was setting up the new gear, Sheriff Mills drove up. He had that look on his face, the one that said he was about to ask me something he didn't want to. "John," he said, climbing out of his cruiser, "do we need to talk about these attacks?" I nodded, wiping my hands on my jeans. "What about them?" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "There's been talk. People are scared. They're saying it might be something unnatural." I thought about the footage I'd seen, the creature that defied explanation. For a moment, I considered telling him everything, but who would believe me? "It's probably just a big cat," I said instead. "Mountain lion, maybe?" The sheriff didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. "Just be careful, all right? And call us if you see anything strange." As he drove away, I felt a pang of guilt for not telling him the truth. But what could I have said? That there was a monster stalking my farm, something out of a nightmare. That night, I sat on my porch with my old hunting rifle across my lap. The new floodlights cast harsh shadows across the pasture, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sheep began to bleat in panic, huddling together in the center of the field. I stood, my heart pounding. The floodlights flickered, then went out completely. In the sudden darkness, I could hear something moving, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. My hands shook as I raised the rifle, peering into the gloom. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, at the edge of the pasture, I saw them. Two glowing yellow eyes, fixed directly on me. The creature stepped into view, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. It was even larger than it had appeared on camera, easily 8 feet tall. As it moved towards me, I could see saliva dripping from its jaw, sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. I fired, the sound of the shot shattering the night silence. The creature roared, a sound that shook me to my very core, but it didn't fall. Instead, it charged. I barely had time to chamber another round before it was upon me. I fired again and again, but it was like shooting at a freight train, unstoppable. At the last moment, I dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as massive claws swept through the space where I'd been standing. I rolled, coming up in a crouch, my rifle lost in the chaos. The beast turned, those terrible eyes locking onto me once more. I was certain this was the end, but then a miracle happened. The floodlights suddenly blazed to life, bathing the yard in harsh white light. The creature recoiled, letting out a pained howl. It backed away, shielding its eyes with one massive paw. For a moment, we stared at each other, me, trembling and defenseless. The creature, caught in the light it seemed to fear. Then, with a final bone-chilling growl, it turned and bounded away into the darkness. I sat there for a long time, my heart racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. When I finally found the strength to stand, I noticed something on the porch where the creature had been. Caught on a loose nail was a tuft of coarse, dark fur. In the days that followed, I fortified my farm as best I could. More lights, stronger fences. I even considered selling the place and moving to the city, but this land has been in my family for generations. I couldn't just abandon it. The attacks have stopped, for now. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind is high, I hear that growl again, and I know it's out there, watching, waiting. I've thought about telling others what I've seen, but who would believe me? So I keep my secret, and I keep watch, because I know the truth now. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that shouldn't exist but do. And if you ever find yourself in the countryside on a dark night and you hear something moving in the shadows, something too big to be any normal animal, remember my story. Remember that not all monsters are myths, because out there, in the wild places where the old fears still hold sway, something is hunting. And it's only a matter of time before it hunts again. Story 7. The moment I saw that dark shape glide beneath our boat, I knew we weren't alone on that god-forsaken lake. What started as a peaceful fishing trip quickly turned into a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist in these waters, or any waters. My name's Mike, and I've been fishing these parts for over 30 years. I thought I knew every inch of Lake Blackwater, every fish that swam in its depths. But that day, that terrible day, I learned how wrong I was. It was supposed to be a routine trip. Me, my buddy Dave, and his son Tyler, out for a weekend of fishing and relaxation. We'd done it 100 times before. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, calm water, just a hint of a breeze. We launched our small motorboat at dawn, eager to get to our favorite spot near the center of the lake. The first few hours were great. We caught a few decent-sized bass, shared some laughs, cracked open a few beers. Tyler, at 17, was just starting to get into fishing, and it was nice to see him enjoying himself away from his video games and phone. It was around midday when things started to feel off. The fish stopped biting, which wasn't too unusual for that time of day, but there was something else, a heaviness in the air that I couldn't quite explain. The lake was too quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects conspicuously absent. "Hey, Mike," Dave called from the back of the boat. "You ever seen the water this still?" I looked around, realizing he was right. The surface of the lake was like glass, not a ripple in sight. It was unnatural, eerie even. That's when Tyler spotted it. "Dad, look!" he shouted, pointing at something in the water about 50 yards from the boat. At first, I thought it was a log or maybe a bunch of weeds. But then it moved, gliding just beneath the surface with a grace that no log could manage. It was big, much bigger than anything that should be in this lake. "What the hell is that?" Dave muttered, leaning over the side of the boat for a better look. I felt a chill run down my spine. "And I don't know, but maybe we should head back to shore." As if in response to my words, the shape suddenly changed direction, heading straight for our boat. It moved fast, leaving a V-shaped wake behind it. "Start the engine!" I yelled at Dave, who was closest to the motor. He yanked on the cord, but the engine just sputtered and died. He tried again, and again, but nothing. We were dead in the water. The thing was getting closer now, and I could make out more details. It was easily 20 feet long, with a serpentine body that undulated as it swam. But it was the head that made my blood run cold. It was large and elongated, almost crocodilian, but with features that didn't belong to any creature I'd ever seen. "What is that thing?" Tyler's voice was high with panic. I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that we were in serious danger. The creature circled our boat, each pass bringing it closer. I could see its eyes now, large and intelligent, fixed on us with an intensity that was terrifyingly human-like. "We need to get out of here," Dave said, his voice tight with fear. Maybe we should try to paddle to shore." I nodded, not taking my eyes off the creature. "Slowly, don't make any sudden movements." We each grabbed an oar and began to paddle, trying to keep our strokes smooth and quiet. For a moment, it seemed to be working. We were making progress towards the shore, and the creature had backed off a bit. Then, without warning, it charged. The impact nearly capsized us. Water sloshed over the sides of the boat as we struggled to stay upright. I caught a glimpse of scales and teeth as the creature's massive head rose out of the water, jaws snapping at the air just inches from where Tyler sat. "Hold on!" I shouted, grabbing a fishing rod and swinging it like a club. It connected with a solid thwack, and the creature recoiled, disappearing beneath the surface. For a moment, all was quiet. We huddled in the center of the boat, hearts pounding, waiting for the next attack. "Look!" Tyler pointed to the shore. A small dock was visible, maybe 100 yards away. "Paddle!" Dave yelled, and we all grabbed our oars, desperation giving us strength. We made it about halfway before the creature struck again. This time, it came from below, ramming the bottom of the boat with enough force to crack the hull. Water began to seep in, slowly but steadily. "We're not going to make it," Tyler said, his voice trembling. I looked at the dock, then at the frightened faces of my friends. An idea formed, one born of desperation and fear. "Dave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "When I say go, you and Tyler jump and swim for the dock. Don't look back, don't stop, just swim." Dave's eyes widened as he realized what I was planning. "Mike, no, we're not leaving you." I shook my head. "Someone has to distract it. Give you two a chance." Before he could argue further, I saw the dark shape approaching again. "Now, go." Dave hesitated for just a moment, then grabbed Tyler and leaped into the water. They began to swim, powerful strokes carrying them towards safety. The creature changed course, drawn by the movement. I had seconds to act. I grabbed the last beer can, our emergency flare, and a lighter. With shaking hands, I punctured the can, stuffed the flare inside, and lit it. The makeshift bomb sputtered to life just as the creature's head broke the surface. "Hey, you overgrown tadpole!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Over here!" I hurled the flaming can straight at the beast's face. It exploded in a shower of sparks and foam, momentarily blinding the creature. It thrashed in the water, letting out a roar that shook me to my core. Taking advantage of its distraction, I dove into the lake and began to swim. My arms and legs burned with the effort, but fear drove me on. Behind me, I could hear the creature recovering, could almost feel its presence as it gave chase. The dock was so close now. I could see Dave and Tyler had made it, were shouting and waving at me to hurry. But I was tiring, each stroke slower than the last. Suddenly, something grabbed my leg, pulling me under. I caught a glimpse of those terrible eyes, that mouthful of razor-sharp teeth, before I was dragged into the depths. In that moment, I was certain I was going to die. But some primal instinct took over. I kicked and thrashed, my lungs burning for air. Somehow, miraculously, I broke free. With the last of my strength, I surged towards the surface. My head broke the water, and I gasped for air. The dock was right there, just a few more feet. Hands grabbed me, pulling me up and out of the water. Dave and Tyler dragged me onto the dock, where we collapsed, panting and shaking. For a long moment, we just lay there, too exhausted and terrified to move. Then, slowly, we turned to look at the lake. The water was calm once more, no sign of the monstrous creature that had nearly killed us. Our boat was gone, probably sunk to the bottom of the lake. "What? What was that thing?" Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, still trying to process what had happened. "I don't know, and I don't think I want to know." We reported the incident to the local authorities, of course. But who would believe our story? A 20-foot-long lake monster in a place where the biggest fish was supposed to be a 10-pound bass. We were laughed out of the sheriff's office. But we know what we saw, what we experienced, and we're not the only ones. Since that day, there have been other sightings, other stories. The locals have started calling it the Blackwater Beast. I don't go fishing anymore. Can't bring myself to get back on the water. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself drawn to the lakeshore, and as I stand there, watching the still surface of the water, I wonder, is it still out there, lurking in the depths, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim? So if you ever find yourself near Lake Blackwater, remember our story. Remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that shouldn't exist but do. And whatever you do, don't go in the water. Because in those dark depths, something is waiting, something hungry, something that shouldn't be. Story 8. The first time we heard that bone-chilling howl, we dismissed it as the wind. By the third night, we knew we were dealing with something far more terrifying, something that defied explanation and threatened our very existence. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, lead researcher for a wildlife study in the Cascade Mountains. Our team of 5 graduate students and I had been in the field for 2 weeks, tracking wolf populations and their impact on the local ecosystem. It was supposed to be a routine expedition, the kind I'd led dozens of times before, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered in those remote woods. The trouble began on our 4th night in camp. We were gathered around the fire, discussing the day's findings, when Jakus, one of our more experienced students, suddenly went quiet, his head cocked to one side, listening intently. Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first, I heard nothing but the usual nighttime forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Then, faintly, I caught it. A low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Probably just a wolf," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew that wasn't true. In all my years studying wolves, I'd never heard a call quite like that. The next day, we found the first set of tracks. We were out checking our camera traps when Mia, our team's tracking expert, called us over. What we saw made no sense. The prints were enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf track I'd ever seen. And the shape was off, almost like a wolf print, but with unsettling human-like characteristics. "What do you think, Dr. Chen?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with excitement and a hint of fear. I shook my head, at a loss for words. I'm not sure. Let's take some photos and measurements. Maybe it's some kind of anomaly." But deep down, I knew we were dealing with something beyond the scope of our research. That night, the howls came again, closer this time. We huddled in our tents, listening as the eerie cries echoed through the mountains. Sleep was impossible, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what could be out there. The third day brought more unsettling discoveries. We found a clearing where several trees had been knocked down, their trunks splintered as if hit by some tremendous force. Scattered among the debris were tufts of coarse, dark fur, unlike anything I'd seen before. As I examined one of the fur samples, a chill ran down my spine. This was no wolf, no bear, no known predator. We were dealing with something else entirely. Back at camp, tensions were running high. Half the team wanted to pack up and leave, citing safety concerns. The other half, myself included, were torn between scientific curiosity and a growing sense of dread. "We can't leave," Jake argued. "This could be the discovery of the century. A new species, or maybe—" He trailed off, but we all knew what he was thinking. The local legends, the stories we'd dismissed as campfire tales, creatures that walked on two legs but weren't human, monsters that haunted the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. In the end, we decided to stay one more night. We set up additional camera traps around the camp and agreed to sleep in shifts, always keeping someone on watch. I took the first watch, sitting by the dying embers of our fire, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond our camp. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if every creature was holding its breath, waiting. It was nearing midnight when I heard it. Heavy footsteps, moving through the underbrush with deliberate slowness. My heart began to race as I realized the sound was coming closer. I reached for the flare gun we kept for emergencies, my hand shaking as I loaded it. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then, at the edge of our camp, I saw them. Two eyes, glowing an unnatural yellow in the darkness. They were set too high to belong to any normal animal, and as I watched, frozen in terror, a shape began to emerge from the shadows. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of wolf and human. Thick, matted fur covered its muscular frame, and its hands, if you could call them that, ended in vicious claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me, elongated like a wolf's muzzle, but with an intelligence in its eyes that was disturbingly human. As it stepped into the faint light of our dying fire, its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. I wanted to scream, to wake the others, but terror had robbed me of my voice. The creature took another step forward, its eyes fixed on me with an intensity that froze me in place. In that moment, staring into those alien eyes, I felt something I'd never experienced before. A primal, overwhelming fear that went beyond mere survival instinct. This was the fear our ancestors must have felt, huddled in caves, knowing that monstrous predators lurked in the darkness. The spell was broken by a shout from one of the tents. Jake had woken up, had seen the creature. His yell startled the beast, and it let out a bone-chilling roar that shook me to my core. Chaos erupted in the camp. People scrambled out of tents, screaming and grabbing whatever they could use as weapons. I finally found my voice, shouting orders, trying to organize some kind of defense. The creature charged, moving with a speed that belied its size. It swiped at Jake, who barely managed to dodge, the claws ripping through his tent like it was tissue paper. I raised the flare gun, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. The creature turned towards me, its yellow eyes gleaming with predatory intent. I fired. The flare lit up the night, temporarily blinding the beast. It howled in pain and anger, thrashing about and knocking over our equipment. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing my research bag and heading for the trees. The others didn't need to be told twice. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear the creature recovering, its enraged roars spurring us on. We ran for what felt like hours, the sound of pursuit always just behind us. As the first light of dawn began to pierce the canopy, we finally broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the dirt road where we'd left our vehicles. Gasping for breath, we piled into the SUVs, not even bothering with seatbelts as we peeled out, tires kicking up clouds of dust. It wasn't until we were miles away, the mountain a looming shadow in the rearview mirror, that we finally allowed ourselves to relax. The adrenaline wore off, leaving us shaken and confused. What was that thing?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, still trying to process what we'd seen. "I don't know, but it shouldn't exist. It can't exist." In the days that followed, we debated what to do. Our campsite was still up there, along with most of our equipment and research data. We had an obligation to report our findings, but who would believe us? In the end, we decided to keep quiet. We reported that our expedition had been cut short due to equipment failure and dangerous weather conditions. It wasn't entirely a lie. Our equipment had been destroyed, just not by any natural means. But the memory of that night haunts me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see those glowing yellow eyes, still hear that unearthly howl. I find myself poring over old legends, stories of creatures that walk the line between man and beast. I don't lead expeditions anymore. Can't bring myself to go back into those deep forests, but I know it's out there, waiting, watching. So if you ever find yourself in the remote wilderness and you hear a howl that doesn't sound quite right, remember our story. Remember that there are things in this world that science can't explain, creatures that shouldn't exist but do. And whatever you do, don't go investigating strange noises in the night, because in the depths of the forest, where the old fears still hold sway, something is hunting, and it's only a matter of time before it hunts again. Story 9. The moment I saw those massive footprints in the mud, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary hike. What started as a routine tour through the Appalachian wilderness quickly became a descent into terror, leaving us lost, hunted, and questioning everything we thought we knew about the natural world. My name's Jack, and I've been a wilderness guide for over 15 years. I've led hundreds of tours through these mountains, seen all kinds of wildlife, and weathered my fair share of dangerous situations. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what we encountered that day. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trek, just me and a group of 5 tourists, mostly city folks looking to reconnect with nature. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, the forest alive with color and the promise of adventure. The first day went smoothly. We hiked about 10 miles, set up camp, and spent the evening around the fire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. It was the kind of experience I loved providing, watching people fall in love with the wilderness, seeing the stress of their everyday lives melt away. It was on the second day that things started to feel off. We'd been hiking for a few hours when I noticed the forest had gone unusually quiet. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if every creature was holding its breath. That's when I saw the footprints. At first, I thought they might be bear tracks. We occasionally get black bears in these parts. But as I got closer, I realized these were something else entirely. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, and the shape was all wrong. 5 toes, like a human, but with clear claw marks at the tips. I felt a chill run down my spine as I studied the prints. In all my years in these mountains, I'd never seen anything like this. "What is it, Jack?" Sarah, one of the hikers, asked. The others had gathered around, curious about my discovery. I hesitated, not wanting to alarm them. Not sure, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Probably just a really big bear. But I knew that wasn't true. These weren't bear tracks, weren't the prints of any animal I knew, and judging by how fresh they looked, whatever made them had passed through here recently. We pressed on, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I found myself constantly scanning our surroundings, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. As the day wore on, the sky began to darken. At first, I thought it was just cloud cover rolling in. But the darkness deepened rapidly, far too quickly for natural weather patterns. "Folks," I called out, "looks like we might be in for some nasty weather. Let's pick up the pace and find a good spot to set up camp." We pushed on through the gloom, the forest around us taking on an eerie, otherworldly quality in the strange half-light. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, it was something else. The group froze, fear etched on every face. "What was that?" Mike, the youngest of our group, whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it again, closer this time, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the trees. "Run!" I shouted, my training kicking in. "This way. Stay together." We took off down the trail, panic giving us speed. I could hear something crashing through the underbrush behind us, gaining ground with every second. We burst into a small clearing, and that's when I realized my mistake. In our blind panic, we'd veered off the main trail. I looked around frantically, trying to get my bearings, but in the unnatural darkness, everything looked unfamiliar. "Oh, Jack," Sarah gasped, clutching a stitch in her side. "Where are we?" I swallowed hard, knowing I had to stay calm for their sakes. We've gone off trail, but it's okay. We just need to backtrack," and a roar cut me off, so loud it seemed to shake the very ground. And then, at the edge of the clearing, we saw it. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of ape and bear. Thick, matted fur covered its frame, and its hands, if you could call them that, ended in wicked claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me. A twisted, almost human-like visage, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. For a moment we all stood frozen, the creature and us, locked in a tableau of terror. Then it charged. "Scatter!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. "Get to the trees!" We broke in different directions, the creature's roars and the sounds of pursuit filling the air. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the face of pure animal terror. Eventually, I found myself huddled behind a large boulder, my lungs burning, straining my ears for any sound of the creature. As my panic subsided, guilt washed over me. I'd lost the group. As their guide, it was my responsibility to keep them safe, and I'd failed spectacularly. I spent a terrifying night alone in the woods, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment the creature would find me. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made a decision. I had to find the others. Cautiously, I made my way back towards the clearing where we'd been separated. As I approached, I heard voices, human voices. My heart leapt. I found them huddled together at the base of a large oak tree, Sarah, Mike, and 2 others. They looked terrified but unharmed. "Jack!" Sarah cried when she saw me. "Thank God!" As we reunited, sharing our experiences of the night, a horrible realization dawned on me. We were 1 person short. "Where's Tom?" I asked, dreading the answer. The others exchanged grim looks. We don't know," Mike said quietly. "We heard him screaming, but he didn't need to finish." We all knew what that meant. With heavy hearts, we started trying to find our way back to the main trail. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less threatening, but no less alien. Strange marks on trees, bushes crushed in unnatural ways, and everywhere those massive footprints. It took us most of the day, but we finally found the trail. As we hurried towards the ranger station, I tried to make sense of what had happened. What was that creature? How could something like that exist without anyone knowing? When we finally reached civilization and reported our experience, we were met with skepticism and disbelief. The authorities conducted a search for Tom, but found no trace. They attributed our story to mass hysteria, a shared delusion brought on by fear and exhaustion. But we know what we saw, what we experienced, and we're not the only ones. Since that day, there have been other sightings, other stories. The locals have started calling it the Appalachian Apex. I don't lead tours anymore. Can't bring myself to go back into those woods. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself poring over maps of the area, thinking about what's out there, and I wonder, is it still roaming those mountains? Are there more of them? And what happens when they decide to venture beyond their territory? So if you ever find yourself hiking in the Appalachians and you come across tracks that seem too big to be real, or hear a roar that doesn't sound quite natural, remember our story. Remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that shouldn't exist but do, and whatever you do, don't go investigating strange noises in the night, because in those ancient mountains, where the old fears still hold sway, something is watching, something is waiting, and it's hungry. Story 10. We had no business being up there. Deep down, I think we all knew it, but we were young, bored, and looking for something to stir up the monotony of our small-town lives. The trail to the old ridge overlook had been abandoned for years, closed off after a few rock slides made the path too dangerous for casual hikers. But that didn't stop us. Nothing really stopped us back then. So, when Mike suggested we hike up there one evening, it didn't take much convincing. I should have said no. Hell, any of us could have, but we didn't. Come on, it'll be a killer view at sunset, Mike had grinned, backpack slung over one shoulder as if he'd done this 1,000 times. We'll be back down before it gets dark. We weren't. The hike started easy enough. The trailhead was barely visible anymore, overgrown with weeds and small saplings that hadn't been cleared in years. Still, it was there, hidden just behind a rusted metal sign that warned hikers to proceed at their own risk. None of us took it seriously. Mike led the way, cutting through the underbrush with an energy that made me think maybe he was right. Maybe this would be fun. Ben followed close behind him, his breath coming in sharp puffs from the steep incline, while Sarah stuck close to me. I could tell she was nervous. Her hands fiddled with the straps of her backpack, and her eyes kept flicking over to the trees, like she was expecting something to jump out at us. But I figured it was just the eeriness of the abandoned trail getting to her. It was getting to me too, though I didn't say anything. "Almost there," Mike called over his shoulder. His voice echoed off the trees, bouncing around us in a way that felt unnatural, like the forest was swallowing the sound. "Just a few more switchbacks and we'll be at the overlook." The air was different up there, denser somehow. The kind of stillness that felt heavy, pressing in on us the higher we climbed. Every now and then, a gust of wind would whistle through the trees, but it didn't feel right. It didn't cool my skin or rustle the leaves. It was just sound, and then there was the silence that followed. The deeper we went, the quieter the woods became. No birds, no insects, not even the usual crack of branches underfoot. Just our breathing, and the occasional scrape of Mike's hiking boots against the rocky trail. It felt wrong, like we were intruding on something that didn't want us there. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the overlook. It was exactly as Mike had promised. The valley stretched out below us, a sea of green pines and jagged rock formations, with the sun sinking low on the horizon, casting everything in shades of gold and amber. For a moment, it was peaceful, beautiful, even. Mike threw his arms out wide, like he'd conquered the mountain. "See? Totally worth it." Ben nodded, pulling a water bottle from his pack. "Yeah, this is pretty sweet." Sarah stood next to me, her eyes scanning the horizon, but there was no smile on her face. "Let's not stay too long, okay?" she said quietly. I wanted to tell her everything was fine, but there was something in her voice that made me pause. She wasn't scared of the hike. No, this was something else. And if I was being honest with myself, I felt it too. Mike was the first to notice the tracks. He had wandered off a bit from the group, down toward a patch of bare ground at the edge of the overlook. "Hey guys, come check this out." I walked over to where he was standing and stopped short when I saw it. There, pressed into the soft dirt, was a set of footprints. No, not footprints. They were too big for that. Huge, actually. Each print was easily twice the size of my boot, and deep, like whatever had made them was heavy, really heavy. "What the hell?" I muttered, kneeling down for a closer look. The prints were fresh, too fresh. The edges were crisp, untouched by wind or rain. Ben came up behind me, frowning. "Must have been a bear," he said, though there was doubt in his voice. "Bears don't walk like this," Mike pointed out, his voice a little too casual. He was trying to play it off, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "These look different." I stood up, brushing the dirt off my hands. "Whatever made these, we should probably get going. It's starting to get late." Sarah, who had stayed a few paces back, glanced up at the sky. The sun had dipped lower now, the light fading fast. "Yeah, let's head back." We gathered our things and started down the trail, but the mood had shifted. No one was laughing or joking anymore. Even Mike seemed subdued, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by a quiet urgency. The forest, once still, now felt oppressive, like it was closing in on us with every step. The first sound came about halfway down the trail. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the trees, coming from somewhere behind us. We all stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. "Did you guys hear that?" Ben whispered, his voice tight. I nodded, gripping the straps of my backpack a little tighter. "Yeah, we need to move. Now!" We picked up the pace, almost jogging down the uneven trail, our feet slipping on loose gravel. The growling came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't a bear, I knew that much. No bear made sounds like that. It was deeper, more primal. The trees around us seemed to stretch taller, their branches clawing at the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the trail. My heart was pounding, not just from the exertion, but from the rising sense of dread that was wrapping itself around my chest. Something was out there, something big, and it was following us. Another sound, a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing, just the darkening woods. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the fear bubbling up in my throat, threatening to spill out in a scream. Mike was ahead of us, moving faster now, practically running. "Come on, keep up," he shouted, his voice high-pitched with panic. We followed, the trail a blur beneath my feet. The sounds behind us grew louder, more branches breaking, more growls, low and angry, like whatever was out there was hunting us. I could feel it in my bones. Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a rock, and I reached out to grab her arm before she fell. "You okay?" I asked, breathless. She nodded, eyes wide with fear, but didn't say anything. We kept moving. That's when we saw it. Just ahead on the trail, in the fading light, a massive figure stood between the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with broad shoulders and limbs too long for any animal I'd ever seen. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, watching us. Mike skidded to a stop, nearly colliding with it. "Oh, shit!" The creature didn't move at first, just stared at us with those glowing eyes. Then slowly it shifted, stepping forward, its massive feet crunching against the rocks and dirt. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, part man, part animal, with matted fur covering its body and claws that gleamed in the twilight. Panic hit me like a wave. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and yanking her down the trail. We bolted, hearts pounding in our chests, the creature's heavy footsteps echoing behind us. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to keep running, to get away, to survive. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop, not with that thing behind us. The trail blurred past in a haze of trees and shadows, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter, but never disappearing. We kept running until we burst out onto the dirt road where we'd parked the car. Ben fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. We piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the creature emerged from the trees. It stood at the edge of the road, watching us, its chest heaving with each breath. For a moment, it didn't move, just stared at us with those glowing eyes. Then, as if deciding we weren't worth the chase, it turned and disappeared back into the woods, leaving us in stunned silence. No one spoke the entire drive back to town. That night, as I lay in bed, the image of those glowing eyes haunted me. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just an animal. It wasn't something we could explain away. It was something ancient, something that didn't want us in its territory. And it was still out there. Story 11. The woods have a way of playing tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone at night. But what I encountered that evening wasn't just my imagination running wild. It was something far more terrifying, something that shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name's Jack, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of strange things out here, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air feels sharp in your lungs and the leaves crunch satisfyingly under your boots. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on campsites and making sure no one was causing trouble. As I drove down the winding forest road, my radio crackled to life. "Jack, you there? We've got another report of that big animal sighting near Creekside Campground. Can you check it out?" I sighed, reaching for the radio. "And copy that. Sarah, I'm on my way." We'd been getting an increasing number of these reports over the past few weeks. Campers and hikers swearing they'd seen some massive creature lurking in the shadows. Most of the time, it turned out to be a bear, or even just an oddly shaped tree stump. But something about the frequency and consistency of these sightings had started to nag at me. I pulled up to Creekside Campground, the beams of my headlights cutting through the darkness. The place was deserted this time of year, save for a single RV parked near the tree line. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, the cool night air hitting my face. As I approached the RV, an older man poked his head out, looking visibly shaken. "You the ranger?" he asked, his voice quavering slightly. I nodded, introducing myself. "Mind telling me what you saw, sir?" The man, who introduced himself as Bill, recounted how he and his wife had been sitting by their campfire when they heard something large moving in the woods nearby. "It wasn't like anything I've ever heard before," he said, his eyes wide. "The footsteps were so heavy, and there was this smell, like wet dog, but worse." I jotted down some notes, trying to keep my expression neutral. It was the same story I'd heard a dozen times before, but something about the fear in Bill's voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Did you see anything?" I asked. Bill shook his head. "Not clearly, but I swear I saw something huge move between the trees. It was too big to be a bear, and it seemed to be walking on two legs." I thanked Bill for his time and assured him I'd investigate. As I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I'd dealt with all sorts of wildlife in my years as a ranger, but something about this felt different. I decided to do a sweep of the area surrounding the campground. The forest was eerily quiet as I made my way down one of the hiking trails, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the path. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my feet and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. That's when I saw it, a footprint right in the middle of the trail. But this was no ordinary animal track. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with distinct toe impressions that looked disturbingly human-like. My heart began to race as I crouched down to examine it more closely. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft earth. Whatever had made this had passed through very recently. I stood up slowly, suddenly very aware of my surroundings. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows between the trees growing deeper and more menacing. A twig snapped somewhere off to my left, and I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I thought I saw something move, a large, dark shape melting back into the shadows. But it was gone so quickly, I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast darkness of the forest. "This is Park Ranger Jack Thompson. Is anyone there?" No response came, but I could have sworn I heard something, a low, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, but deeper and more guttural than anything I'd ever heard before. It sent a chill down my spine. I took a few cautious steps forward, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my belt. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of branches breaking, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. My training kicked in, and I began to back away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the direction of the sound. "Hey there," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "No need to be afraid. I'm not here to hurt you." Another growl, louder this time, and definitely not my imagination. It was a sound that spoke to something primal in me, triggering an instinct to run that I had to fight to control. I continued to back away, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Suddenly, the forest around me erupted into motion. Something huge burst from the undergrowth, a massive dark shape that seemed to blot out the stars as it rose to its full height. In the beam of my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, powerful limbs, and a face that was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. I didn't think. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I knew was the overwhelming need to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Finally, I burst out of the tree line and into the clearing where I'd parked my truck. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I caught movement in my rearview mirror, a massive shape at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw an intelligence there that chilled me to my core. Then I was peeling out of there, gravel spraying as I accelerated down the forest road. It wasn't until I was miles away, with the lights of the ranger station in sight, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. The events of that night changed me. I've spent countless hours since then poring over reports of similar sightings, talking to cryptozoologists, and trying to make sense of what I saw. Some days, I can almost convince myself it was all just a product of stress and an overactive imagination. But then I remember those eyes, that terrifying intelligence, and I know the truth. There's something out there in the woods, something that defies explanation. And the really scary part, I don't think it's alone. I still work as a ranger at Blackwood. Someone needs to be out there, to keep an eye out and make sure people stay safe. But I never go into those woods alone at night anymore. And when the sun starts to set and the shadows grow long, I can't help but wonder, what else is out there, watching and waiting in the darkness? Story 12. I've been a ranger for almost 10 years now, and I've seen just about everything these woods have to offer. Lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, even the occasional illegal campsite, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I experienced that night. It's something I can't quite explain, and I've tried to push it out of my mind, but it keeps creeping back in when the wind howls through the trees or the night gets a little too quiet. It all started with a routine patrol. It was mid-October, and the days were getting shorter, the kind of cool, crisp air that makes the forest feel alive in a different way. I was assigned to the northern edge of the park, a remote area where people weren't supposed to camp, but they did anyway. Usually, it was just kids looking for a place to drink without getting caught or someone wanting to avoid the park fees. That night was different, though. I remember sitting in my truck, the heater humming low, as I reviewed my patrol route. The sun had already dipped behind the mountains, leaving the sky a bruised shade of purple. The radio crackled with static, a low murmur of chatter from other rangers in the area. Most of them were signing off for the night. I should have been too. But I'd gotten a report earlier that day about a possible illegal campsite just off the old dirt road, near an old clearing that hadn't seen visitors in years. I figured I'd drive up, check it out, and head back. Easy enough, right? I'd done it 100 times before. I turned off the main road and onto the narrow, uneven trail that led deeper into the woods. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches forming a dark tunnel above. The headlights cut through the blackness, revealing only the road ahead. I kept my eyes on the trail, but the deeper I drove, the more I felt this strange tension in the air. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was like the forest was watching me. I know how that sounds, but it's the best way I can describe it. After about 20 minutes of driving, I reached the clearing. I pulled off to the side and killed the engine, letting the sudden silence wash over me. I stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at my skin, and grabbed my flashlight from the seat. The clearing was wide, ringed by tall pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. A perfect spot for someone looking to camp out unnoticed. I clicked on the flashlight and started scanning the area. At first, it seemed empty. No tents, no fire pits, not even the usual beer cans or trash left behind. But something caught my eye at the far end of the clearing, just beyond the tree line. I squinted, shining the beam of light toward it. Footprints, big ones. I've seen a lot of tracks in my time, deer, coyotes, bears, but these were different. The prints were large, too large for any person, and too narrow to belong to a bear. And there were only 2 of them, bipedal. I knelt down, running my fingers over the edge of one of the prints. It was fresh. The ground was still soft, the edges of the footprints sharp. Whoever, or whatever, made these hadn't been gone long. I felt a chill run up my spine. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was the eerie silence that seemed to hang over the clearing. But suddenly, I didn't want to be out there anymore. I straightened up, the beam of my flashlight still focused on the prints. I should have turned back right then. I should have gotten in my truck, radioed it in, and let it go. But I didn't. Instead, I followed the tracks. They led away from the clearing, deeper into the woods. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to press in around me. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but only barely. The woods were dense here, thicker than I remembered. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart pounding in my chest. The footprints continued, leading me through a narrow gap between the trees. I moved slowly, careful not to make too much noise, though I wasn't sure why I was being so cautious. It was just some camper, right? Maybe someone in a costume, messing around before Halloween. But the deeper I went, the less I believed that. About 10 minutes into my trek, I heard it, a low, deep growl. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it stopped me dead in my tracks. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just darkness and shadows. But that sound, it wasn't my imagination. I crouched low, shining the light at the ground again. The tracks were getting deeper, more pronounced, like whatever made them was heavier now, pressing harder into the earth. And there was something else. The spacing between the prints was growing wider. Whoever or whatever was picking up speed. I stood up, heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't right. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person. It was something else. Something I didn't want to meet face to face. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again, closer this time. A deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The forest was deathly silent now, except for that sound. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand shook, sweeping across the trees in a frantic search for movement. Then something moved. A shadow, low to the ground, slipping between the trees. I swung the light toward it, but it was gone, swallowed by the darkness before I could get a good look. My pulse was racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This was wrong. I shouldn't be here. I needed to leave. Now. I started backing up, one slow step at a time, keeping the light trained on the trees. My hand reached for the radio clipped to my belt, but I didn't pull it free. I didn't want to make any noise. The growling had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the flashlight beam, just beyond the trees, something was watching me. Two glowing eyes, reflecting the light back at me, stared from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to be an animal, but too low to be a person. I couldn't make out the shape, but I could feel it. I could feel its gaze locked onto me, cold and predatory. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as sandpaper, and slowly started to retreat. My boots crunched against the fallen leaves and twigs, the sound deafening in the silence. The eyes didn't move, they just watched. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the dark, too scared to blink, too scared to turn my back on it. It felt like an eternity. My brain screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my body refused to cooperate. I was rooted to the spot. Like some primal part of me knew that if I moved too fast, if I made a sound, whatever was out there would pounce. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the eyes vanished. 1 second they were there, gleaming in the darkness, and the next they were gone. I didn't wait to find out what that meant. My legs finally found their strength, and I turned, bolting back the way I'd come. Branches tore at my jacket as I crashed through the trees, the flashlight swinging wildly in my hand. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I needed to reach the truck. Behind me I could hear it, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, pounding the earth with a weight that shook the ground beneath my feet. It was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, if I hesitated for even a second, it would be on me. I burst out of the tree line, the clearing just ahead. My truck was parked at the far end, the headlights barely visible in the distance. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming with every step. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I could hear its breath now, rasping, labored, like it was exerting every ounce of its strength to catch me. I reached the truck, fumbling with the keys as I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into reverse, tearing out of the clearing without looking back. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road, my heart still racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had turned white. Whatever it was, it didn't follow me, but I could still feel it out there, lurking in the darkness, watching, waiting. And that's the thing. I've been back to that clearing since, but I've never seen those tracks again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm patrolling those same woods, I hear it. That low, guttural growl, echoing through the trees. Whatever it is, it's still out there, and it knows I'm still here too. Story 13. The crackle of our dying campfire was the only sound that dared to break the eerie silence of the forest. We huddled close, our eyes darting nervously between the tree line and each other's pale faces. None of us wanted to be the first to say it, but we all knew something was out there, watching us. My name's Alex, and I've been an avid camper for as long as I can remember. The great outdoors has always been my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of everyday life and find peace in the simplicity of nature. But after what happened on that fateful camping trip, I'm not sure I'll ever look at the wilderness the same way again. It started innocently enough. My friends and I had planned this trip for months, a week-long adventure in the remote backcountry of the Cascade Mountains. We were experienced outdoorsmen, confident in our abilities to handle whatever nature might throw our way, or so we thought. The first few days were perfect. We hiked through breathtaking landscapes, fished in crystal-clear streams, and spent our evenings around the campfire, sharing stories and laughing under the stars. It wasn't until the fourth night that things started to feel off. I was the first to wake up that morning, crawling out of my tent to start the coffee. The moment my feet hit the ground, I knew something was wrong. Our campsite, which we'd left meticulously tidy the night before, looked like it had been ransacked. Our food containers were scattered across the clearing, their contents spilled and partially eaten. The heavy cooler we'd suspended from a tree branch to keep away from bears had been ripped down, its side dented as if it had been thrown with incredible force. "Guys!" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." One by one, my friends emerged from their tents, their sleepy expressions quickly turning to shock as they took in the scene. "What the hell happened?" Mike asked, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I shook my head, crouching down to examine one of the food containers. "I don't know, but whatever did this, it wasn't a normal animal." That's when I saw them, the footprints. At first glance, they looked almost human, but much, much larger. Each print was easily 15 inches long, with clear impressions of 5 toes. They circled our campsite, weaving between our tents in a way that seemed almost deliberate. A chill ran down my spine as I followed the tracks with my eyes. They led right up to where I had been sleeping, pausing just outside my tent before continuing on. "Guys," I said, my mouth dry, "I think we should pack up and get out of here." No one argued. We spent the next hour in tense silence, hastily shoving our gear into our packs, the weight of unseen eyes pressed down on us, making every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig sound like a threat. Just as we were about to leave, Sarah let out a gasp. "Look," she said, pointing to the edge of the clearing. There, half hidden in the shadows of the dense forest, was a figure. It was only visible for a split second before it melted back into the trees, but that glimpse was enough to turn my blood to ice. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. We didn't wait around to see more. We hit the trail hard, pushing ourselves to cover as much ground as possible. But as the day wore on, an unsettling feeling grew in the pit of my stomach. The forest, usually teeming with life, was unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no scurrying of small animals. It was as if everything was holding its breath, waiting. As dusk approached, we were forced to make camp again. None of us wanted to stop, but continuing in the dark would have been suicide in this terrain. We chose a small clearing, setting up our tents in a tight circle. "We should take turns keeping watch," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. The others nodded in agreement, their faces a mix of fear and exhaustion. I took the first watch, perching on a fallen log at the edge of our camp. The forest at night had always felt magical to me, full of mystery and wonder, but now it felt oppressive, the darkness between the trees hiding untold dangers. It was during my watch that I first heard it, a deep, rumbling breath that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my hand inching towards the hunting knife at my belt. "Hello?" I called out, wincing at how small and afraid my voice sounded. "Ooh, is someone there?" No response came, but I could have sworn I saw movement in the trees, something large shifting in the shadows. I woke Mike for his watch, my hands shaking as I crawled into my tent. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, every shift of the wind through the trees had me sitting bolt upright, my heart racing. When dawn finally broke, it was almost a relief, but that relief was short-lived. As we emerged from our tents, we found our campsite once again in disarray. This time, however, the destruction was far more targeted. Our backpacks had been torn open, their contents strewn about, but it was what was missing that truly terrified us. All of our food was gone, every last scrap. "It's trying to strand us out here," Sarah whispered, voicing the fear we were all feeling. We salvaged what we could and hit the trail again, pushing ourselves even harder than the day before. But as the hours wore on, it became clear that we were lost. The landmarks didn't match our map, and our GPS devices were inexplicably malfunctioning. As the sun began to set on our second night of terror, desperation set in. We made camp in a small cave, hoping its narrow entrance would provide some protection. That night, huddled around our meager fire, we finally talked about what we'd all been thinking. "What if it's real?" Mike asked, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. What if all those stories, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, what if they're true? I wanted to dismiss the idea, to say it was impossible, but after what we'd seen, what we'd experienced, I couldn't. I don't know, I admitted. But whatever it is, it's intelligent, and it's hunting us. We fell into an uneasy silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the cave walls, and that's when we heard it, heavy footsteps approaching the cave entrance. We scrambled to our feet, pressing ourselves against the back wall of the cave. A massive silhouette filled the entrance, blocking out the starlight. The stench hit us then, a powerful, musky odor that made my eyes water. For a long moment, nothing moved. We stood frozen, barely daring to breathe as the creature surveyed our hiding place. Then, slowly, it began to retreat. We spent the rest of the night in terrified silence, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, we made a break for it, abandoning most of our gear in favor of speed. I don't remember much of that last day. It's a blur of fear and exhaustion, of pushing through pain and fatigue with the singular goal of survival. Somehow, miraculously, we stumbled onto a ranger station just as the sun was setting. The rangers were skeptical of our story at first, but the haunted look in our eyes and our clearly traumatized state convinced them to launch a search. They never found any concrete evidence of what we encountered. No footprints, no hair samples, nothing that couldn't be explained away as a bear or other known wildlife. But I know what I saw. What we all saw. There's something out there in the wilderness, something that defies explanation, and it's watching, waiting for unwary travelers to venture into its domain. I still go camping occasionally, but never in the backcountry, and I always sleep with one eye open, listening for heavy footsteps in the night. Story 14. I didn't think much of it when we set up camp by the lake. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace and quiet, just me and my buddy Greg, 2 coolers of beer, and the calming sound of the water lapping at the shore. The weather was perfect for it, crisp autumn air with just a hint of the chill that had been coming in a few weeks. The trees around the lake had already turned, and the whole place was like a postcard. Perfect for fishing, perfect for clearing your head. That's what I thought anyway. I should have paid more attention to the quiet. I should have realized sooner that the normal sounds, the rustling of leaves, the calls of birds, the bugs chirping, were all missing. The silence was just too thick, but by the time I noticed, it was too late. We got there around noon, set up the tents, and spent most of the afternoon casting our lines from the shore. The fish weren't biting much, but that didn't bother us. We had plenty of beer to pass the time. Greg, as usual, was his chatty self, making dumb jokes about the big one that always gets away and telling the same stories I'd heard 100 times. "I swear, man, I saw a trout this big last time we were here," he'd say, holding his arms wide like he was describing a damn shark. It was like it wanted to get caught, just to mess with me. I laughed along, not really paying attention. My mind had started to drift, just enjoying the rhythm of casting out and reeling back in. The lake was still, barely a ripple on the surface, and the sun was starting to dip low, casting orange and pink reflections across the water. I could have fallen asleep right there on the bank. It wasn't until the sun was almost gone that I felt it, that prickle on the back of my neck. You know the one. The feeling that something's not quite right, that there's someone or something watching you. I glanced over at Greg, but he was focused on his line, muttering something about needing to switch bait. I scanned the tree line. Nothing, just tall pines and the darkening sky above them. But the hairs on my arms were standing up, and my chest felt tight, like the air had gotten too heavy. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the quiet getting to me. "We should probably start the fire soon," I said, more to break the silence than anything. Greg nodded, but he didn't say much. That wasn't like him. He was never quiet. By the time we got the fire going, it was fully dark. The kind of dark that only happens when you're out in the middle of nowhere, with no city lights or headlights to chase it away, just the firelight flickering off the trees and the lake, which had gone from peaceful to eerie. The water was completely still, like a sheet of black glass stretching out in front of us, reflecting nothing but the pinpricks of stars overhead. I tried to ignore the feeling that had settled deep in my gut. It was stupid, I told myself. We'd camped out here before. Nothing had ever happened. It was just a quiet night, but that quiet was starting to weigh on me. The fire crackled, but there was no wind, no rustle of branches, not even the usual hum of insects. I hadn't heard a single frog or cricket since we got here, and now that I thought about it, that seemed wrong. "Hey, Greg," I said, poking at the fire with a stick. "You notice how quiet it is?" Greg looked up from the fire and shrugged. "Yeah, I guess. Maybe it's the season. Animals are probably hunkering down for the cold." "Yeah, maybe." But I didn't believe it. The woods didn't just go silent like this. Even in autumn, there was always something. An owl, a coyote in the distance, the crunch of leaves as something moved in the underbrush. Out here, there was always life. I tried to brush it off. We ate our dinner by the fire, talking about nothing in particular, but the unease in my chest just wouldn't let up. Every now and then, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, the water, the shadows cast by the fire. It felt like the darkness was creeping closer, pressing in on us. Then it happened. A sound. It was subtle at first. So subtle that I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time, a splash. I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. Greg heard it too, his eyes snapping toward the lake. "You hear that?" I whispered, not sure why I was whispering in the first place. "Yeah, probably a fish." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. It wasn't the quick, random splash of a fish jumping. It was heavier, like something big had entered the water. We both sat there, staring at the lake. The fire crackled behind us, casting flickering shadows across the water, but the lake itself was still, as if nothing had disturbed it at all. Then the splash came again, closer this time, and this time I could hear something else, a low, deep sound like a growl but muffled by the water. It sent a shiver down my spine. I looked at Greg, who had gone pale, his usual bravado gone. "That doesn't sound like a fish," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stood up slowly, my eyes still locked on the lake. "No, it doesn't." The water remained calm, but I could feel it. Something was out there, something big, and it was watching us. My gut was screaming at me to get away from the shore, to move back to the trees, but I couldn't look away. I was transfixed by the stillness of the water, waiting for something to break the surface. And then it did. A ripple started at the far end of the lake, small at first, but growing, spreading out in a perfect circle. Something was moving beneath the water, something huge. I could see the dark shape just below the surface, and it was heading straight for us. "Greg, we need to go," I said, my voice shaky, but Greg didn't move. He was frozen, staring at the water, his mouth hanging open like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. "Greg!" I grabbed his arm and yanked him away from the shore. Finally, he snapped out of it, stumbling backward. "What the hell is that?" he gasped, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but we're not sticking around to find out." We backed away from the lake, keeping our eyes on the water, but the ripples had stopped. Whatever it was, it had disappeared beneath the surface again. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind raced with possibilities. A massive fish, a beaver. No, this was bigger, much bigger. We made it back to the fire, but I didn't feel any safer. The firelight felt weak, like it wasn't enough to keep whatever was out there at bay. Greg was breathing hard, pacing around the camp, his hands shaking. "We should leave," he said, his voice shaky. "Pack up and get the hell out of here." I wanted to agree, but the rational part of my brain fought back. It was late. The trail back to the truck was long, and navigating it in the dark wouldn't be easy. Besides, there was a part of me that still couldn't believe what we'd seen. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the lake was playing tricks on us. But then I heard it again. This time it wasn't a splash. It was a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath our feet. It came from the direction of the water, but it didn't sound like it was in the lake anymore. It sounded closer, too close. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam toward the lake, but there was nothing, just the still, black water reflecting the firelight. But the growl was still there, deep and guttural, echoing through the trees. My skin prickled with fear. "Greg," I whispered, "we need to go, now!" He didn't argue. We scrambled to grab our gear, stuffing what we could into our packs, leaving behind anything we didn't absolutely need. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip up my bag, but I forced myself to move. I could still hear the growling getting louder, closer, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. Something moved in the shadows at the edge of the water. It was massive, its form just barely visible in the dim light. But I could see the outline of it. Tall, hunched, with long limbs and glowing eyes that reflected the firelight. It stood at the shore, staring at us, motionless. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I grabbed my pack and bolted for the trees, Greg right behind me. We ran, not caring about the trail, just trying to put as much distance as we could between us and the lake. Behind us, the growling grew louder, more aggressive, as if whatever it was had decided we were prey. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could do was run, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. Even now, I can't explain what we saw. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that lake. Not ever. Story 15. The perfect shot. That's what I was after when I ventured into the snow-covered wilderness that fateful day. Instead, I found myself in a nightmare, pursued by something that shouldn't exist, a creature that turned me from photographer to prey in the blink of an eye. My name is Ethan, and I've been a wildlife photographer for the better part of 2 decades. I've captured images of some of the most elusive creatures on the planet, from snow leopards in the Himalayas to jaguars in the Amazon. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of northern Minnesota. It was early February, sir, and I'd heard rumors of an unusually large wolf pack roaming the area. The prospect of photographing these magnificent animals in their winter habitat was too tempting to resist. I packed my gear, rented a cabin on the outskirts of the Superior National Forest, and set out into the wilderness. The first few days were frustrating but uneventful. I caught glimpses of deer and the occasional fox, but the wolves remained elusive. It wasn't until the 4th day that I stumbled upon something truly extraordinary. I had risen before dawn, hoping to catch the early morning light. The forest was silent, save for the crunch of snow beneath my boots and the occasional crack of a branch succumbing to its wintry burden. As I crested a small hill, I saw them, tracks in the fresh snow. At first, I thought I'd finally found my wolves. But as I knelt to examine the prints more closely, my excitement turned to confusion. These weren't wolf tracks. They were too large, too widely spaced. And there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the frigid air. The prints appeared to be bipedal. My rational mind immediately began searching for explanations. A bear, perhaps, though they should have been hibernating. Or maybe it was just a trick of the light, the wind having distorted the tracks. But deep down, I knew I was grasping at straws. Curiosity overrode caution, and I began to follow the trail. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from any marked paths. I lost track of time as I moved through the trees, my camera forgotten as I focused on the mysterious spoor before me. It wasn't until I paused to catch my breath that I realized how far I'd come. The forest had grown denser, the trees pressing in close on all sides. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach as I glanced around, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement, something large and dark, moving with a fluidity that belied its size. For a moment, our eyes met. I say eyes, but what I saw were two glowing orbs, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly not animal. In that instant, every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I was a photographer first, and almost without thinking, I raised my camera and clicked the shutter. The flash seemed to trigger something in the creature. It let out a bone-chilling roar and burst into motion, charging through the underbrush with terrifying speed. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, crashing through the snow-laden branches, with no regard for direction or safety. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I fled through the forest, my lungs burning with each gasping breath. Behind me, I could hear the creature in pursuit, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Finally, my foot caught on a hidden root, and I went sprawling into the snow. I scrambled to my feet, certain that this was the end, but as I turned to face my pursuer, I found myself alone in a small clearing. The forest was silent once more, save for my ragged breathing. I stood there for what felt like hours, straining my ears for any sound of the creature. But there was nothing. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. As the adrenaline began to fade, the cold started to seep in. I realized with a start that I had no idea where I was or which direction I'd come from. My mad dash through the forest had left me completely turned around. Night was falling fast, and I knew I needed to find shelter. With no better option, I chose a direction at random and started walking, hoping to find some landmark I recognized. As darkness settled over the forest, an eerie quiet descended. No owls hooted, no small creatures rustled in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. I walked for hours, each step becoming more labored as fatigue and cold set in. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees. Relief flooded through me as I quickened my pace, envisioning a warm cabin and safety. But as I drew closer, that relief turned to confusion, then to dread. The light wasn't coming from a cabin or a campfire. It was coming from my own rental cabin, the one I'd left that morning. Somehow, impossibly, I'd ended up right back where I'd started. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my keys and let myself in, slamming the door behind me and throwing every lock. Only then did I allow myself to collapse, my body trembling from cold and delayed shock. As I warmed up and my mind began to clear, I remembered my camera. With trepidation, I turned it on and began to scroll through the photos I'd taken that day. Most were as expected, scenic shots of the snowy forest, a few animals. And then I reached the last photo. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the center of the frame, was a shape. It was blurry, partially obscured by trees, but unmistakably bipedal. Covered in dark fur, it stood at least 8 feet tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. But it was the eyes that truly chilled me, glowing orbs that seemed to stare right through the camera and into my soul. I spent a sleepless night in that cabin, jumping at every creak and groan of the old structure. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time in packing my things and heading for my car. As I was loading the last of my gear, something caught my eye. There, in the snow just beyond the cabin's porch, was a single massive footprint, and next to it, glinting in the early morning light, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. I left it there. Part of me wanted proof, wanted to show the world what I'd seen, but a larger part knew that some things are better left undiscovered. I got in my car and drove away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I've never returned to those woods, and I've never shared the photo I took that day. Some nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself staring into the darkness, wondering, what was that creature? Was it some undiscovered species, a relic from a prehistoric age? Or was it something else entirely, something that defies scientific explanation? I don't have answers, but I do know this. The wilderness holds secrets, ancient and powerful. And sometimes, when we go looking for the perfect shot, we find ourselves captured instead, forever changed by a glimpse of the unknown. Story 16. There was something about hiking in the snow that always felt peaceful to me. The stillness of it, the way the world seemed muted under a blanket of white. But that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My breath fogged the cold air as Sarah and I pushed up the trail, the crunch of our boots against the snow the only sound for miles. We were alone on the mountain, or at least we thought we were. "I love it up here," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice echoed in the emptiness of the trees, the kind that seemed to swallow sound. "It's like the whole world's gone quiet. You know?" I nodded, but the feeling in my gut didn't match her calm. Sure, the snow made everything serene, but this silence was different. It felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I didn't say anything, though. I figured it was just me being paranoid. We'd been planning this hike for weeks, and I didn't want to ruin it for her with my unease. The path we were on had been closed for years, too dangerous in the winter, according to the park signs. But that only made it more appealing. Sarah loved a challenge, and the ridge had a view that was supposed to be incredible, especially with the snow-capped peaks around it. We were maybe an hour from the top, and so far the trail had been manageable. A few steep parts, but nothing we couldn't handle. As we rounded a bend in the trail, something caught my eye. It was just a flicker at first, a dark shape against the snow, but it was enough to make me stop. "What is it?" Sarah asked, noticing I'd paused. "I don't know," I said, squinting through the trees. "I thought I saw something. Probably just a shadow." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. We kept going, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye. Quick, fleeting, and always just out of focus. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but when I turned to look, there was nothing, just trees and snow. It was around then that we found the tracks. "Hey, check this out," Sarah called from up ahead. I hurried to catch up and found her standing next to a set of footprints, deep in the snow. "Looks like we're not the only ones out here," she said, gesturing to the tracks. At first glance, they looked human, but as I stared down at them, something felt off. The prints were huge, way bigger than any boot print I'd ever seen, and the stride was long, too long for a normal person. I knelt down to get a better look. The snow was packed down, where the foot had pressed into it, but the edges of the print were sharp, like it had been made recently. And whatever had made them was heavy. Really heavy. "These are fresh," I said, standing up. "And big." Sarah glanced at the prints again, her brow furrowed. "Maybe a guy with snowshoes." I shook my head. "No, these aren't snowshoes. Look at the shape." She crouched down, studying the tracks more closely. "You're right. So what? A really big guy?" I didn't have an answer. The more I looked at the tracks, the more uneasy I felt. They continued down the trail ahead of us, disappearing into the trees. Whoever or whatever had made them was headed in the same direction we were. "Maybe we should turn back," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Sarah looked up at me, surprised. "You serious? We're almost at the ridge." "I know, but something about this feels wrong." She stood up, brushing snow off her gloves. "Look, if someone's up there, we'll just say hi and keep our distance. It's not like we're the only people who've ever ignored a trail closure." I hesitated, but then nodded. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just some other hiker. But those prints, something about them stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something we didn't want to be a part of. We kept going, following the tracks as they wound higher up the mountain. The air grew colder, and the snow deepened, making it harder to move quickly. My breath came in sharp puffs, fogging the air in front of me, and Sarah had stopped talking, her focus on the trail ahead. That's when we noticed the tracks had changed. "Wait," I said, stopping again. "Do you see that?" The tracks had been steady, spaced out, like someone walking at a normal pace. But now they were farther apart. The snow churned up in places like whatever made them had started moving faster, running maybe, and something else. The prints were deeper now, like more weight had been pressed into the snow, almost like it was being chased. "Okay, this is weird," Sarah muttered, staring down at the disturbed snow. "Maybe they fell. Or they were running," I said, feeling that knot of unease in my stomach tighten. "Something spooked them." She frowned but didn't argue. We stood there for a moment, the only sound the wind whispering through the trees. And then, from somewhere far off in the distance, I heard it. A deep, low howl that sent a shiver through me. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was long and guttural, vibrating through the air like it was coming from something massive, something that didn't belong in these woods. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat tight. "We should go back." But before we could move, another sound reached us, closer this time. A crack, like a branch breaking, followed by a heavy, thudding noise. My heart raced as I scanned the trees, searching for the source. The forest around us was thick, the shadows deep, but I could feel it now. Something was out there, watching us. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I grabbed Sarah's arm, urging her back the way we came, but she was frozen, her eyes locked on something just beyond the trees. "Wait," she whispered. "Look." I followed her gaze, and my blood ran cold. There, standing just inside the tree line, was a figure, tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette massive against the snow. It was half hidden in the shadows, but I could see enough to know that whatever it wasn't human. Its limbs were long and twisted, its posture hunched like it was too big for the space it occupied, and those eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, locked onto us with an intensity that made my heart slam against my ribs. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. The thing took a step forward, its foot landing with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the ground beneath us. That was all it took. The spell broke, and I yanked Sarah's arm, pulling her back down the trail. "Go!" I shouted, my voice hoarse with fear. "Run!" We tore down the mountain, our boots slipping on the snow as we ran, the sound of our own breathing loud in our ears. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it behind us, those heavy footsteps, crashing through the trees, getting closer with every second. Sarah stumbled, and I grabbed her, pulling her to her feet as we kept moving. The trail was a blur beneath us, the trees closing in around us as we raced down the mountain. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind us, the footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear the thing's breath now, ragged and wet, like it was right on top of us. We burst out onto a flat section of the trail, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. The thing was there, just at the edge of the trees, its massive form silhouetted against the snow, but it wasn't running anymore. It stood there, watching us, its glowing eyes following our every move. It didn't need to chase us, it knew we wouldn't come back. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, breathless and shaking, our bodies soaked with sweat despite the freezing cold. Sarah fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling as she unlocked the door. We threw ourselves inside and slammed the door shut, the silence of the car a stark contrast to the terror we'd just fled. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, staring out at the dark forest beyond the windshield. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, my hands still gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. "I don't know, but we're never coming back here." And we didn't. Whatever was out there on that mountain, it could have the ridge, it could have the whole damn trail. We wouldn't be around to challenge it again. Story 17. The moment I saw the mutilated carcass, I knew our hunting trip had taken a dark turn. What we encountered in those woods, wasn't just an animal. It was a predator that made us question our place in the food chain. A beast that turned seasoned hunters into terrified prey. I'm Mike, and I've been hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle. The annual trip with my buddies, Tom and Jake, was a tradition we'd kept for over a decade. We'd tackle the rugged terrain of the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana, testing our skills against the wilderness and hoping to bag an elk or two. But this year, something else was hunting in those mountains, something that hunted us. It started on our second day out. We'd set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by dense pine forest. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the mountains loomed around us, their peaks already dusted with early snow. It was perfect hunting weather, and our spirits were high as we set out at dawn. We'd been tracking a bull elk for most of the morning, following its trail deeper into the wilderness. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small creatures, the familiar symphony of nature that I'd grown to love over years of hunting trips. But as we pushed further into a particularly dense stretch of woods, an eerie silence fell. Tom was the first to notice. "You hear that?" he whispered, his hand tightening on his rifle. Jake and I paused, straining our ears. That's when it hit me. The absolute absence of sound. No birds chirping, no squirrels chattering. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving the forest in an unnatural hush. "Something's not right," I murmured, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the day. We pressed on, more cautiously now, our senses on high alert. The trail led us to a small clearing, and that's where we found it, the remains of what must have been a massive elk. But this wasn't a clean kill. The carcass had been torn apart, great chunks of flesh ripped away with savage force. What struck me most was the wastefulness of it. This wasn't predation for food, it was killing for the sake of killing. "Jesus!" Jake breathed, his face pale. "What could have done this?" I crouched down to examine the carcass more closely, my years of hunting experience kicking in despite the gruesome scene. The wounds were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They weren't the neat punctures of a mountain lion or the ragged tears of a bear. These were massive, deep gashes that spoke of incredible strength and ferocity. That's when I noticed the trees at the edge of the clearing. Deep gouges marred their trunks, far too high to have been made by any normal animal. Some of the marks were easily 10 feet off the ground. "Guys," I said, my mouth suddenly dry, "I think we should head back to camp." As if in response to my words, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the forest. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between that made my blood run cold. We didn't need any more convincing. We turned and began to make our way back the way we'd come, moving as quickly and quietly as we could through the underbrush. The silence of the forest now felt oppressive, broken only by the sound of our labored breathing and the occasional snap of a twig under our boots. We were about halfway back to our camp when Tom suddenly stopped short. "Listen," he hissed. At first, I heard nothing. Then it came again. A faint, rhythmic thudding. Footsteps, heavy ones, moving fast through the forest parallel to our position. "Run!" I yelled, abandoning all pretense of stealth. We crashed through the underbrush, our hearts pounding in our ears. The footsteps grew louder, faster, closing in on us with terrifying speed. I chanced a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving with unnatural agility, dodging between trunks and leaping over fallen logs. We burst into our campsite, gasping for air. "Pack up now," I ordered, already moving to grab my gear. "We need to get out of here." As we hastily shoved our belongings into our packs, an unearthly howl split the air. It was close, too close. Without a word, we abandoned the rest of our gear and ran for the trail that would lead us back to our truck. The descent was treacherous, our usual caution forgotten in our desperation to put distance between us and whatever was pursuing us. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us at every step, but we pushed on, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. We were maybe a mile from where we'd parked when Jake went down hard, his ankle twisting with a sickening crack as he landed. Tom and I skidded to a stop, turning back to help our fallen friend. "Leave me!" Jake gasped through gritted teeth, his face contorted with pain. "It's coming!" But there was no way we were leaving him behind. Tom and I hoisted Jake to his feet, supporting him between us as we continued our frantic retreat. Our progress slowed considerably, and I could hear our pursuer gaining ground. The forest around us came alive with movement, shadows flitting between trees, branches snapping, that terrible growl growing ever closer. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, the trees thinned, and I caught a glimpse of our salvation, the dusty forest road where we'd left our truck. With a final burst of energy, we stumbled out of the tree line. As Tom fumbled with the keys, I turned back towards the forest. There, at the edge of the trees, it stood. In the fading light, I could make out a massive, hair-covered form, easily 8 feet tall. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intelligence, fixed on us with predatory intensity. For a long moment, we stared at each other, hunter and hunted, separated by mere yards of open ground. Then, with a roar that shook me to my core, it charged. I don't remember getting into the truck. The next thing I knew, we were tearing down the forest road, gravel spraying from our tires. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the creature as it burst from the tree line, its howl of frustration fading as we put distance between us. We drove straight through the night, not stopping until we'd reached the safety of civilization. Jake's ankle was badly sprained, but otherwise we were physically unharmed. Mentally, though, we were shaken to our core. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what we'd encountered. We scoured the internet for similar stories, reached out to cryptozoologists, even considered going to the authorities. But in the end, we kept it to ourselves. Who would believe us? And more importantly, what if someone did believe us and decided to go looking for the creature? I still hunt, but never in those mountains. The experience changed me, changed all of us. It opened our eyes to the possibility that there are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that lurk in the dark corners of the world. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that creature. Was it some undiscovered species, a relic from a prehistoric age? Or was it something else entirely, something that defies scientific explanation? I don't have answers. But I do know this: the next time you're in the wilderness and the forest falls silent, when you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, trust your instincts. Because out there, in the vast expanses of the wild, we're not always the top of the food chain. Sometimes we're just another prey animal being stalked by something far more ancient and deadly than we can imagine. Story 18. There's a kind of silence that feels wrong in the woods. You expect quiet, sure, wind in the trees, the occasional rustle of leaves. But there's always some noise, something alive around you. The silence I felt that day, though, was different. It was thick, pressing in on me like the forest itself was holding its breath. And as I stood at the entrance of that hidden cave, every instinct in my body screamed that I shouldn't go inside. But I did. I'd been out there for work, mapping animal migration patterns in a part of the forest that was mostly untouched by hikers. This was my 3rd day in the area, and I was pretty far from any of the popular trails. My job was to gather data, mark territories. Nothing too exciting, but this forest had always intrigued me. There were stories, whispers about people getting lost, strange sightings. I figured it was just locals trying to scare city folks off the more dangerous areas of the park. That was, until I found the cave. I stumbled on it purely by accident. I'd been following a trail of deer tracks when I noticed an odd gap between the trees. The underbrush was thick, but there was a narrow path leading through it. I don't know why I followed it. Curiosity, I guess. There was something unnatural about the way the trees had grown, like they'd twisted away from the spot ahead, almost recoiling. When I pushed through the final layer of brush, There it was, a cave, half hidden at the base of a rock formation, the entrance wide and dark like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. Something about it set me on edge immediately. I'd been in caves before, sure, but this one felt different. The air was colder near the entrance, and the silence was almost unbearable. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, debating whether I should go in. My mind told me to turn back, to leave this place alone, but my feet didn't listen. I stepped inside. At first, the cave seemed like any other, cold, damp, with the smell of wet stone filling the air. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The walls were narrow, close enough that my shoulders brushed the rock as I walked deeper. The ground sloped down slightly, pulling me further in. That's when I started to notice the bones. They were scattered across the floor of the cave, small at first, like birds or rodents, the kind you might expect in a place like this. But the deeper I went, the larger the bones became. Deer, maybe elk. Some were still intact, the clean white of their skeletons glowing under the beam of my flashlight. Others were broken, cracked, as if something had gnawed on them. My stomach twisted. This wasn't right. I should have turned around. I knew it. Every step I took felt heavier, like I was pushing against an invisible force, something that didn't want me there. But I kept going, driven by a mix of fear and fascination. I needed to see what was at the end of the tunnel. The further I went, the more I noticed strange markings on the cave walls. At first, I thought they were natural, just the way the rock had formed over time. But as I traced my flashlight over them, I realized they weren't random. They were deliberate, deep gouges, like something with claws had carved them into the stone. The marks were too high up, too evenly spaced to be an animal just scraping by. No, this was something else. Something that had been here for a long time. A chill ran down my spine, and for the first time, I truly considered turning back. I glanced over my shoulder at the narrow tunnel behind me, but the thought of going back the way I'd come, through that long, dark stretch of cave, felt even worse than moving forward. Then I heard it. At first, it was a soft noise, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. A shuffle, like something moving, just ahead of me. My heart hammered in my chest, and I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear it again. There it was, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the stone floor. It was faint, but unmistakable, coming from deeper within the cave. My hand shook as I tightened my grip on the flashlight, the beam flickering slightly as if the batteries were about to die. I should have left right then and there, but I didn't. I inched forward, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I pointed it into the darkness ahead. The tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, the ceiling rising above me in a dome of jagged rock. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just more bones, more of those strange claw marks on the walls, but then the light caught something else, something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the chamber, half hidden in the shadows, was a pile, a mound of bones, yes, but mixed in with them were pieces of clothing, torn fabric, a boot, the remnants of something, or someone, that had been here before me. I stepped closer, my legs moving on autopilot, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The smell hit me next, rotting, decaying flesh. It was faint, but it was there, lingering in the cold air of the cave. My stomach churned, and I gagged, covering my mouth with my hand. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the pile, half hidden by the bones, was a hole in the ground. It wasn't natural, that much was clear. It was too perfectly round, too smooth, like something had dug it out deliberately. My flashlight flickered as I shone it down into the hole, but I couldn't see the bottom. The beam just disappeared into blackness. And then, from deep within the hole, I heard the sound again. That dragging, scraping noise, closer now, louder. Something was coming up. Panic shot through me like electricity, and I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned, ready to bolt back the way I'd come, but as I did, the ground beneath me shifted. The dirt and rocks under my feet slid, and I fell hard, my flashlight flying out of my hand and skittering across the cave floor. The light went out. I was plunged into complete darkness, the kind that swallows you whole. I could feel the cold stone beneath my hands, the dampness of the air against my skin, but I couldn't see a thing. I scrambled, trying to find the flashlight, my hands clawing at the ground in blind panic. The dragging noise was closer now, echoing off the walls of the cave. Whatever was down there was coming up, and it was moving fast. Finally, my fingers brushed against the cold metal of the flashlight, and I snatched it up, fumbling to turn it back on. The light flickered to life, weak but enough to see by. I swung the beam back toward the hole, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was there. Something was crawling out of the hole, something massive and dark. Its body was twisted, unnatural, limbs too long for its frame, claws scraping against the stone as it pulled itself up. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was wrong, pale, almost featureless, with deep-set eyes that seemed to reflect the light in a way that made my skin crawl. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. I tore through the cave, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as I stumbled over rocks and bones. The narrow tunnel felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in tighter with every step. I could hear the thing behind me, its claws scraping against the stone, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The entrance to the cave was just ahead, a faint glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. I pushed myself harder, my feet slipping on the loose dirt, my heart pounding in my ears. I burst out into the open air, the sunlight blinding me for a moment as I stumbled forward. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the mountain, my chest heaving, my body trembling with adrenaline. When I finally stopped, doubled over and gasping for breath, I turned back. The cave entrance was barely visible through the trees, just a dark shadow in the side of the mountain. There was no sign of the thing that had chased me, no sound, no movement, but I knew it was still there. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that had been hiding in that cave for a long time. And I had been stupid enough to wake it. I never reported the cave. I never went back. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it. Story 19. The storm hit without warning, turning our leisurely hike into a desperate fight for survival. But as we huddled in that dank cave, listening to the howling wind outside, we realized that nature's fury was the least of our worries. Something was in there with us, something ancient and hungry. My name is Sarah, and I've been an avid hiker for most of my life. The Appalachian Trail has always held a special place in my heart, with its rugged beauty and challenging terrain. So when my friends Lisa and Mark suggested a week-long trek through a remote section of the trail, I jumped at the chance. We set out on a crisp autumn morning, the air filled with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for, breathtaking vistas, invigorating climbs, and nights spent around the campfire sharing stories and dreams. On the 3rd day, things began to change. The weather, which had been perfect until then, took a turn for the worse. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them a biting wind that cut through our layers of clothing. Maybe we should turn back, Lisa suggested, eyeing the ominous sky, but we were already halfway to our next checkpoint, a rustic shelter nestled in a valley. We're closer to the shelter than the trailhead, I argued. We'll be fine if we pick up the pace. Mark agreed with me, and after a moment's hesitation, Lisa nodded. It was a decision we would come to regret. The rain started about an hour later, a light drizzle that quickly turned into a downpour. The trail became treacherous, slick with mud and hidden roots. We pressed on, our spirits dampened but not broken. Then came the lightning. The first bolt struck so close it left us momentarily blinded, the accompanying thunder shaking the ground beneath our feet. That's when we knew we were in real trouble. "And we need to find shelter now," Mark yelled over the howling wind. We left the trail, seeking higher ground away from the trees that now posed a deadly threat. As we scrambled up a rocky slope, Lisa spotted it, a dark opening in the cliff face. "There!" she shouted, pointing. "A cave!" Without hesitation, we made for the cave entrance. It was a tight squeeze, but we managed to get through, collapsing on the damp floor as we caught our breath. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we took in our surroundings. The cave was deeper than it had first appeared, stretching back into the mountain. The air was heavy with a musty, organic smell that made me wrinkle my nose. "At least we're out of the storm," Mark said, trying to sound optimistic as he dug a flashlight out of his pack. We set up a makeshift camp just inside the entrance, spreading out our wet gear in hopes it might dry. As night fell, the storm continued to rage outside, flashes of lightning illuminating the cave in brief, stark bursts. It was during one of these flashes that I first saw them, the bones, scattered across the cave floor, half buried in the dirt. My breath caught in my throat. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Look!" Mark's flashlight beams swept across the cave floor, revealing more and more bones. Some were clearly animal, the unmistakable skull of a deer, the ribcage of what might have been a bear, but others looked disturbingly human. "We need to get out of here," Lisa said, her voice tight with fear, but one look outside confirmed that wasn't an option. The storm had intensified, turning the world beyond our little cave into a maelstrom of wind and rain. "We're safer in here than out there," Mark insisted, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. We huddled closer together, the presence of the bones adding a macabre element to our already tense situation. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling sound coming from deep within the cave. At first I thought it was thunder, but as it continued, a steady, rhythmic sound, I realized with growing horror that it was something else entirely. It was breathing. "Please tell me you guys hear that too," Lisa whispered, her eyes wide in the dim light. Mark nodded, his face pale. "It's probably just the wind," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The breathing grew louder, accompanied now by a scraping sound, like something large moving over rock. Whatever it was getting closer. We scrambled to our feet, pressing ourselves against the cave wall. Mark's flashlight beam danced erratically across the cave as his hand shook. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Is someone there?" The only response was a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It was a sound that spoke to something primal in me, triggering an instinct to flee that was almost overwhelming. But there was nowhere to run. The storm still raged outside, and whatever was in the cave was between us and the only exit. The scraping sound grew louder, and then, at the edge of the flashlight's beam, something moved. It was massive, its form indistinct in the shadows, but I caught a glimpse of matted fur and gleaming eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. Lisa let out a strangled cry, and the creature responded with a roar that shook dust from the cave ceiling. It charged forward, moving with a speed that belied its size. What happened next was chaos. We scattered, our survival instincts kicking in. I found myself deeper in the cave, stumbling over rocks and bones in the near-total darkness. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of struggle, of panicked breathing and inhuman growls. I don't know how long I ran, my lungs burning, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I only stopped when I realized I could no longer hear anything behind me. I stood there in the pitch darkness, straining my ears for any sound. There was nothing but the distant rumble of thunder and the sound of water dripping somewhere nearby. "Lisa! Mark!" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response came. I was alone, lost in the bowels of the mountain with no light, and no idea which way led back to the entrance. And somewhere in that darkness, a monster lurked. Time lost all meaning as I felt my way through the cave system. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. The darkness pressed in on me, a physical presence that threatened to crush me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when the panic and claustrophobia were about to overwhelm me, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light. Hope surged through me as I moved towards it, my pace quickening. The cave entrance loomed before me, the storm beyond now reduced to a gentle rain. I burst out into the open air, gulping it down like a drowning person finally breaking the surface. It wasn't until I'd put several hundred yards between myself and the cave that I allowed myself to stop. That's when the full weight of what had happened hit me. My friends were still in there, possibly hurt, possibly... I couldn't bring myself to finish that thought. I made my way down the mountain in a daze, eventually finding a park ranger station. I told them about the storm, about taking shelter in the cave, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them about what we'd encountered in there. Who would believe me? A search and rescue team was dispatched, but they found no trace of Lisa or Mark. The official report cited treacherous conditions and possible flash floods as the likely cause of their disappearance. But I know the truth. There's something in those mountains, something that's been there for a very long time. Something that sees us not as fellow creatures, but as prey. I don't hike anymore. The wilderness that I once loved now fills me with a deep, primal fear. Because I know that out there, in the dark places of the world, monsters still exist, and sometimes they hunt us. Story 20. The first night in the cabin, I woke up to something scratching at the walls. It wasn't loud at first, just this faint, persistent scraping noise. My mind tried to rationalize it, maybe a branch swaying in the wind, or some animal sniffing around outside, but as I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling, it became impossible to ignore. Whatever it was, it wasn't natural. We'd rented the place for the weekend, hoping for a quiet escape into the woods. It was supposed to be peaceful, a break from the noise of the city. Just me, my wife, Emma, and our 7-year-old son, Jake. We'd found the cabin online, tucked away in a dense forest, miles from the nearest town. Perfect for unwinding, right? That first night, after we arrived, everything seemed fine. We grilled outside, watched the sun set through the trees, and played cards by the fireplace after Jake went to bed. The kind of night that felt like it was ripped out of a family vacation brochure. The stars were so bright above us, the woods so quiet, except for the crackling of the fire. The world felt safe, but now, lying awake in the dark with Emma softly snoring next to me, that feeling of safety had dissolved. The scratching continued, this time closer, moving along the length of the cabin's exterior. I tried to focus, but the sound seemed to be coming from every direction, first near the front door, then shifting toward the back where the bedrooms were. Something was circling us. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Emma, and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I made my way to the front door. I hesitated for a moment, listening for any other sounds. Silence. That kind of oppressive, unnatural silence you only hear in the dead of night. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and I could feel my pulse quicken. Was it just an animal? A raccoon or a stray dog? But raccoons didn't usually make that kind of noise. And dogs wouldn't drag their claws like that. I opened the door a crack and shined the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the outline of the trees and the thick underbrush surrounding the cabin. Nothing moved. I swept the light around, half expecting to see something, anything, but the yard was empty. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and walked around the side of the cabin, following the direction of the sound. There, in the dirt near the foundation, were deep, fresh claw marks. They cut through the earth in long, uneven lines, too large to belong to any animal I could think of. My stomach turned, a cold dread settling in. This wasn't right. I heard a shuffle behind me, something moving through the trees, and I swung the flashlight around. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a shadow slipping between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and hunched in a way that made my skin crawl. But as soon as I blinked, it was gone. Just trees and darkness. I stood there, my breath clouding the air, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get back inside. My mind raced, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but there wasn't one. Something was out here, something bigger and stranger than I could understand. I hurried back into the cabin and locked the door behind me. Emma stirred as I climbed back into bed, but she didn't wake up. I lay there, heart pounding in my chest, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to start again. But the scratching had stopped. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. The next morning, I didn't say anything to Emma. What could I say? That I'd seen something in the woods, something that shouldn't exist. She would have laughed it off, told me it was just the wind or a trick of the light. So I let it go, convincing myself that maybe she was right. Maybe it had just been my imagination. We spent the day exploring the trails around the cabin, Jake running ahead with a stick in his hand, pretending to be some kind of forest explorer. It was a beautiful day, the kind that made you forget about everything else. But that uneasy feeling from the night before stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. It wasn't until that evening, after we'd all settled back into the cabin, that I noticed something was wrong again. As the sun began to set, I went outside to grab some firewood from the stack near the side of the cabin. That's when I saw it. More claw marks. They were fresh, running along the length of the cabin's outer wall. They hadn't been there when we arrived. I knelt down to get a better look, my stomach sinking. These weren't just scratches in the dirt. They were deep gouges in the wood, like something had dragged its claws down the side of the cabin. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly, and looked toward the trees. They were still. No wind, no movement. Just that oppressive silence again, hanging over everything. I grabbed the firewood and went back inside, trying to shake off the fear that was creeping in. But as I loaded the logs into the fireplace, I couldn't stop thinking about those marks. Something was out there, and it wasn't an animal. That night, after we'd put Jake to bed, I told Emma about the scratches. Probably just a bear, she said, not even looking up from her book. These aren't bear marks, Emma, I insisted. They're too long, too deep, and bears don't circle cabins like this. She raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? It's the woods. There's all kinds of wildlife out here. I wanted to argue, to tell her about the thing I'd seen in the trees, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I just nodded and muttered something about keeping an eye out. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard the scratching again. This time it was louder, more aggressive, like something was trying to get in. I sat up in bed, straining to hear where it was coming from. It moved along the wall, the sound of claws scraping against wood, getting closer and closer to the window near our bed. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, barely daring to look, and there, just outside the window, was a shape, a tall, dark figure, standing just beyond the glass. It was hunched over, its massive frame barely visible in the dim moonlight, but I could see its eyes. Pale, reflective eyes, staring right at me. I froze, my body locked up in terror, and I couldn't breathe. The thing just stood there, its breath fogging up the window, its eyes unblinking. I wanted to scream, to wake Emma, but the sound wouldn't come. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in my own fear, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment it was standing there, staring at me, and the next it had vanished into the darkness. The scratching stopped. The night went silent again. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to process what I'd just seen. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Had it really been there, or was I losing it? The next morning, I checked the window. Sure enough, the same deep claw marks were etched into the wood, right where the thing had been standing. Emma saw them too, but she still brushed it off as some animal. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. We packed up that day, cutting our trip short. I didn't care if Emma thought I was being paranoid. I wasn't going to wait around to see what that thing would do next. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It looked so peaceful from the outside, nestled in the trees, surrounded by the quiet of the forest. But I knew the truth. I knew that something was out there, something that didn't belong in those woods. And whatever it was It was still watching us. Story 21. The camera footage shouldn't exist. What we captured on film defied explanation, challenging everything we thought we knew about the natural world. But as we huddled in our tent that night, listening to those unearthly sounds, we realized that some discoveries come at a terrible price. I'm Dr. Emily Chen, a wildlife biologist specializing in large predators. When reports started coming in about an unidentified animal terrorizing livestock in the remote forests of northern Idaho, my team and I jumped at the chance to investigate. Little did we know that we were about to stumble upon something that would shake the foundations of modern zoology and put our lives in danger. Our team consisted of myself, my research assistant Jake, and our field technician Maria. We arrived in the small town of Pine Creek on a crisp autumn morning, the air tinged with the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The locals were wary but grateful for our presence, eager for answers about what was killing their animals. "It ain't no normal predator, that's for sure," old Tom, a grizzled rancher, told us as we set up our base camp. "Been raising cattle in these parts for nigh on 50 years, and I ain't never seen anything like it." We spent the first few days interviewing locals and examining kill sites. The evidence was disturbing, to say the least. The carcasses we found had been torn apart with incredible force, far beyond what a bear or mountain lion could do, and the tracks, when we did find them, they were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Large, with distinct toe impressions, but not matching any known species. On the fourth day, we ventured deeper into the forest, setting up trail cameras and hair traps. The mood was tense. Even the forest itself seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the wildlife was hiding from something. "I don't like this, Em," Jake muttered as we finished setting up our last camera. "Something feels off." I was about to reassure him when Maria called out from a few yards away, "Guys, you need to see this." We hurried over to find her crouched by a large oak tree. At first, I didn't see what had caught her attention. Then she pointed, and my breath caught in my throat. There, about 8 feet up the trunk, were deep gouges in the bark, claw marks, but far larger and higher than any bear could reach. "What could have done this?" Jake whispered, his face pale. I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years studying predators, I'd never seen anything like it. We made camp that night in a small clearing, the mood somber as we discussed our findings. As darkness fell, an eerie silence descended on the forest. No owls hooted, no small creatures rustled in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We scrambled for our recording equipment, managing to capture a few seconds of the sound before it faded away. As we huddled around the laptop, playing back the recording, a chill ran down my spine. The vocalization was unlike anything in our extensive database of animal sounds. "Maybe it's some kind of undiscovered bear species," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Maria shook her head. "No bear moves like what we've been tracking. This is something else entirely." As if in response to her words, a branch snapped loudly just outside our camp. We froze, eyes straining in the darkness beyond the circle of our firelight. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw something move, a large, dark shape melting back into the shadows. None of us slept much that night. We took turns keeping watch, jumping at every sound. As dawn broke, we were exhausted but eager to check our trail cameras. What we found would change everything. Most of the cameras showed nothing unusual. Deer, the occasional fox or coyote. But the last one, the one we'd set up near the tree with the claw marks, had captured something extraordinary. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. At first, the frame was empty. Then, a massive shape moved into view. It was bipedal, covered in dark fur, easily standing 8 feet tall. The creature moved with an uncanny grace, its movements fluid despite its size, but it was the face that truly chilled me, a mix of ursine and primate features, with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. We stared at the image in stunned silence, the implications of what we were seeing slowly sinking in. This was no known animal. This was something else. "We need to get this back to the university," I said, my voice shaky. This could be the zoological discovery of the century. But as we packed up our camp, a sense of unease grew. The forest seemed to press in around us, shadows deepening despite the morning sun, and all the while I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We were about halfway back to our vehicle when Maria suddenly stopped short. "Listen!" she hissed. At first I heard nothing. Then it came, the sound of heavy footfalls, moving parallel to our position but just out of sight. Something was pacing us, keeping to the denser parts of the forest. "Run!" I whispered, and we took off, our packs bouncing painfully against our backs as we crashed through the underbrush. The thing in the forest kept pace effortlessly, its powerful strides audible even over our panicked breathing. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, we burst out onto the logging road where we'd parked our SUV. As Jake fumbled with the keys, I turned back toward the forest. There, at the edge of the tree line, it stood. In the clear light of day, it was even more impressive and terrifying than in the grainy trail cam footage. Its eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw something that shook me to my core. Recognition. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. There was an intelligence there, ancient and alien. We peeled out of there, gravel spraying from our tires. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the creature as it melted back into the forest, its roar of frustration fading as we put distance between us. The days that followed were a whirlwind of debriefings, examinations of our evidence, and heated debates with colleagues. Many were skeptical, suggesting our footage was an elaborate hoax. Others were more open to the possibility, pointing out that new large mammal species are still being discovered in remote areas. But I knew what I had seen. The image of those intelligent eyes stayed with me, haunting my dreams. A month after our encounter, I received a cryptic email from a colleague at the Smithsonian. Apparently, similar sightings had been reported in remote areas across North America for decades, always dismissed as legends or misidentifications. But now, with our evidence, people were starting to take notice. As I sit here in my office, preparing for another expedition into those remote forests, I can't help but wonder, what else is out there, hiding in the wild places of the world? And are we ready for what we might find? The creature we encountered challenges everything we thought we knew about evolution, about the history of life on this planet. But it also raises a more immediate, more chilling question. If this creature has managed to stay hidden for so long, what was it about our presence that finally drew it out? And more importantly, now that we know it's there, is it hunting us? Story 22. The scratching at the door was just the beginning. What started as an annoyance quickly became a nightmare, as I realized that in this remote wilderness, I wasn't the caretaker, I was the prey. My name is Jack, and I've been the winter caretaker at Whispering Pines Lodge for the past 3 years. It's a dream job for a solitary guy like me. 6 months of peace and quiet in the heart of the Rockies, just me and the howling wind for company. Or so I thought. This winter started like any other. I arrived at the lodge in late October, just as the first real snows were beginning to fall. The owners had already winterized the place, shuttering the windows and storing anything that might attract wildlife. My job was simple: keep the pipes from freezing, make sure the roof doesn't cave in under the weight of the snow, and keep any would-be vandals or squatters away. The first month passed uneventfully. I settled into my routine, spending my days doing minor repairs and my evenings reading or watching old movies on the lodge's ancient TV. The isolation never bothered me. In fact, I relished it. The vast, snow-covered landscape outside my windows was all the company I needed. It was in early December that I first noticed something was off. I woke one morning to find tracks in the snow around the lodge, big tracks, much larger than any animal I was familiar with. They seemed to circle the entire building, as if whatever made them had been looking for a way in. I told myself it was probably just an unusually large bear, maybe desperate for food before hibernation, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The tracks were all wrong, too big, too widely spaced, and eerily human-like in their shape. I radioed down to the ranger station in the valley, but they brushed off my concerns. Probably just a moose, they said. Nothing to worry about. But the tracks kept appearing, night after night, and then came the scratching. It started as a faint sound, barely audible over the constant wind. Just a light scraping at the main door, as if something was testing its strength. I tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on my TV and telling myself it was just branches blown by the wind. But it got louder, and it moved. One night it would be at the front door, the next at the back. Sometimes it seemed to be coming from the roof or from the shuttered windows of the upper floors. Always that same, persistent scratching. I began to dread the setting of the sun. As darkness fell, my anxiety would rise, wondering where the scratching would come from tonight. Sleep became a luxury, snatched in fitful bursts between bouts of that maddening sound. About a week into this nightly torment, I decided I'd had enough. The next time I heard the scratching, I was going to face whatever was out there head-on. I loaded the lodge's shotgun, kept on hand for emergencies, and waited. The scratching started just after midnight, this time at the kitchen door. I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was out there must be able to hear it. With shaking hands, I flipped on the exterior lights and yanked open the door. Nothing. Just swirling snow and the black shapes of pine trees. But as I was about to close the door, relieved and a little embarrassed at my fear, I saw them. Tracks in the fresh snow leading away from the door, and they were huge. I slammed the door shut and threw every lock, my mind reeling. What I'd seen wasn't possible. The tracks were easily 2 feet long, with clear impressions of 5 toes. Whatever had made them had been standing right outside the door, probably for hours, scratching and waiting. That night, the scratching was louder than ever. It moved from door to door, window to window, as if the thing outside knew I was aware of it now and was taunting me. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a low, rumbling growl that shook dust from the rafters. By morning, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept, jumping at every sound, the shotgun clutched to my chest. As soon as it was light enough, I made a break for my truck. I needed to get down to the ranger station, to make them understand that something was very wrong up here. But my truck wouldn't start. The battery was dead, and no amount of trying to jump it would bring it back to life. As I stood there in the biting cold, staring at the useless vehicle, a feeling of dread washed over me. I was trapped. The radio was my next option, but when I tried to call down to the station, all I got was static. The winter storms must have taken out the repeater towers. I was well and truly on my own. That day passed in a haze of fear and desperate planning. I checked and rechecked every door and window, boarding up any that seemed weak. I gathered all the food into the kitchen, creating a fortified space where I could hole up if needed, and I waited. As night fell, the scratching began again. But this time, it was different, louder, more insistent. The thing outside wasn't just testing anymore, it was trying to get in. I huddled in the kitchen, shotgun aimed at the door, as the sounds of splintering wood echoed through the lodge. Whatever was out there, it was tearing its way through the main entrance. With a final, terrible crack, I heard the front door give way. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, accompanied by a smell that made my eyes water. A pungent, musky odor that reminded me of wet dog and rotting meat. I held my breath as the footsteps approached the kitchen. There was a pause, and then the door began to shake under the force of powerful blows. I raised the shotgun, my hands surprisingly steady now that the moment had come. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and there it stood. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders scraping the sides of the doorframe. Thick, matted fur covered its body, and its face was a nightmarish blend of bear and ape features. But its eyes were terrifyingly intelligent, filled with a hunger that was more than just physical. For a moment, we stared at each other, predator and prey, separated by mere feet and the trembling barrel of my shotgun. Then it let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the lodge and charged. I fired, the blast deafening in the confined space. The creature staggered but didn't fall. I pumped the shotgun and fired again and again. On the third shot, it finally went down, crashing to the floor with an impact I felt through my boots. For a long moment, I stood there, ears ringing, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with the creature's foul odor. It lay motionless, dark blood pooling on the kitchen floor. Cautiously, I approached, ready to fire again at the slightest movement. But as I drew closer, the impossible happened. The creature's body began to shimmer, like a mirage in the desert. Before my disbelieving eyes, it seemed to dissolve, its form breaking apart into wisps of shadow that faded away to nothing. Within moments, there was no trace that it had ever existed, no body, no blood, nothing but the splintered door and the lingering smell as evidence of the night's events. I'd love to say that's where the story ends, that I radioed for help when the storms cleared and put this all behind me. But the truth is, I'm still here at Whispering Pines Lodge, because now I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the wild places, just beyond the reach of civilization. And sometimes, on dark winter nights when the wind howls outside my windows, I hear it again, that faint, maddening scratching, and I wonder, was that creature really destroyed? Or is it still out there, waiting for another chance to get in? So I keep watch, shotgun close at hand, because in this vast wilderness, in the long, dark winter nights, you never know what might be scratching at your door. Story 23. The moment I saw it standing on the shore, I knew our peaceful fishing trip had turned into something far more terrifying. What we encountered that day on the remote lake wasn't just an animal. It was a creature that shouldn't exist. A monster that turned seasoned outdoorsmen into frightened prey. My name's Mike, and I've been fishing these northern Minnesota lakes for over 3 decades. Every year, my buddies Tom and Dave join me for a week-long trip to Lake Nebagaman, a pristine body of water tucked away in the dense forests of the Boundary Waters. It's always been our escape from the world, a chance to reconnect with nature and each other. But this year, nature had other plans for us. We set out early on a crisp September morning, the mist still clinging to the water's surface as we loaded our gear into the old aluminum boat. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell I've always associated with peace and adventure. If only I'd known then how quickly that peace would shatter. The first few days were perfect. The fish were biting, the weather was clear, and our campfire conversations were filled with laughter and the usual tall tales. It wasn't until the 3rd day that things began to change. We were out on the lake, our boat drifting lazily in a quiet cove as we tried our luck for northern pike. The forest pressed close to the water's edge here, creating a sense of isolation that I'd always found comforting. But on this day, there was something different in the air, a tension, like the feeling just before a thunderstorm breaks. "You guys hear that?" Tom asked suddenly, his voice low. I was about to ask what he meant when I heard it too. A deep, rumbling sound coming from the shore. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Probably just a bear," Dave said, but he didn't sound convinced. We scanned the tree line, our fishing forgotten. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the underbrush, just out of clear sight. "Let's get out of here," I said, reaching for the oars. But before I could start rowing, it emerged. The creature stepped out onto the rocky shore, and for a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It was huge, easily standing 8 feet tall, its body covered in dark, matted fur, but it wasn't a bear. It stood on two legs, its posture unmistakably bipedal. "Oh, what the hell is that?" Dave whispered, his face pale. I couldn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the creature's face, a nightmarish blend of ursine and primate features, with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. Those eyes locked onto our boat, and I saw something in them that chilled me to my core. Hunger. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the water. Then the spell broke. The creature let out a roar that seemed to shake the very air and began to wade into the lake. "Row!" Tom yelled, snapping me out of my shocked stupor. "Row! Damn it!" I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the oars and began to pull with all my strength, desperate to put distance between us and the shore. Dave and Tom grabbed the spare oars, adding their effort to mine. The creature was in the water now, moving with a speed that defied its bulk. Each powerful stroke brought it closer to our little boat, and I could hear its heavy breathing even over the splash of our frantic rowing. "It's gaining on us!" Dave shouted, his voice tight with panic. I didn't dare look back. Every ounce of my focus was on the oars, on the burning in my muscles as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. The shore of the main lake seemed impossibly far away. Just when I thought we couldn't row any harder, I felt something bump the bottom of the boat. The impact nearly knocked me off my seat. "It's under us!" Tom yelled. The boat rocked violently, nearly capsizing as the creature surfaced beside us. A massive, clawed hand reached for the gunwale, and I got a close-up view of its face, the snout filled with sharp teeth, the eyes blazing with predatory intent. Dave, closest to the creature, acted on pure instinct. He swung his oar like a baseball bat, connecting solidly with the thing's head. It let out a roar of pain and anger, momentarily letting go of the boat. That moment was all we needed. With a final, desperate burst of energy, we rowed out of its reach. The creature thrashed in the water behind us, its roars echoing across the lake. We didn't stop rowing until we reached the far shore, our arms trembling with exhaustion. As we pulled the boat up onto the rocky beach, legs shaking so bad we could barely stand, we finally allowed ourselves to look back. The creature was still there, a dark shape against the water, watching us from the middle of the lake. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. "What do we do now?" Dave asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, still struggling to process what had just happened. "We need to get out of here, back to the car, back to civilization." But as the words left my mouth, I realized the horrible truth of our situation. Our car was parked at a landing on the other side of the lake, the side where we'd seen the creature. Between us and safety lay miles of dense, uninhabited forest. We spent a sleepless night on that rocky shore, taking turns keeping watch. Every sound from the forest set our nerves on edge, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But worst of all was the silence. The usual nighttime chorus of frogs and insects was eerily absent, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. As dawn broke, we faced a terrible choice: stay put and hope for rescue, or risk the journey through the forest to our car. In the end, the decision was made for us. Looking out across the lake, we saw it, the creature, standing on the opposite shore, watching us, waiting. "We can't stay here," Tom said, voicing what we were all thinking. "It's only a matter of time before it swims across." And so we set out, armed only with our fishing knives and a flare gun from the boat's emergency kit. The forest, which had always been a place of comfort for me, now felt oppressive. Every shadow held potential danger, every snapping twig a harbinger of doom. We walked for hours, the weight of fear and exhaustion slowing our progress. As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. More than once, I caught glimpses of movement in the trees, always just at the edge of clear sight. It was late afternoon when we heard it, that same rumbling growl that had preceded our first sighting of the creature. It was close, too close. "Run!" I yelled, all pretense of stealth forgotten. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces as we ran. Behind us, I could hear the sound of pursuit, heavy footfalls and the crack of breaking branches as something large moved through the forest with terrifying speed. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, we burst out of the tree line into the parking area where we'd left our car. Never in my life had the sight of that old Ford pickup been so welcome. As Tom fumbled with the keys, I turned back toward the forest. There, at the edge of the trees, it stood. In the clear light of day, it was even more impressive and terrifying than before. Its eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw something that shook me to my core: recognition. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. There was an intelligence there, ancient and alien. We peeled out of there, gravel spraying from our tires. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the creature as it melted back into the forest, its roar of frustration fading as we put distance between us. We drove straight through the night, not stopping until we'd reached the safety of Duluth. We debated going to the authorities, but who would believe us? In the end, we kept the story to ourselves. But it changed us, changed our relationship with the wilderness we'd always loved. I still fish, but never in those remote lakes. The experience opened my eyes to a terrifying truth, that there are things out there in the wild places of the world that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and civilization, we're not always at the top of the food chain. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that creature. Was it some undiscovered species, a relic from a prehistoric age, or was it something else entirely, something that defies scientific explanation? I don't have answers, but I do know this: the next time you're out in the wilderness and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, trust your instincts, because out there, in the vast expanses of the wild, there are monsters, and sometimes they hunt us. Story 24. The first cow disappeared on a moonless night. By the time I saw those gleaming eyes watching me from the darkness, I knew I wasn't dealing with any ordinary predator. This was something else entirely, something that turned a simple Montana ranch into a battleground between man and beast. My name's Frank Holbrook, and I've been running cattle on this stretch of Montana prairie for nigh on 3 decades. It's a hard life, but a good one. Or at least it was, until the night everything changed. It started small, as these things often do. A calf went missing, then another. At first, I chalked it up to coyotes, or maybe a mountain lion that had wandered down from the hills. But when I found the remains of a full-grown steer, its massive body torn apart with a savagery that defied explanation, I knew we were dealing with something far worse. The attacks escalated quickly after that. Every few nights, I'd wake to the sound of bellowing cattle and splintering wood. By the time I'd grab my rifle and rush out to the pasture, all I'd find were broken fences and blood-soaked grass. Whatever was doing this was strong, fast, and smart enough to avoid being seen. I called in the local wildlife officer, a young fella named Mike, who'd only been on the job a few years. He examined the kill sites, his face growing more puzzled with each one. "Frank," he said, crouching by a set of tracks that dwarfed any I'd ever seen, "I've got to be honest with you. I don't know what we're dealing with here. These prints, they're like nothing I've ever seen before." I nodded grimly. "Ain't no bear or mountain lion, that's for sure." Mike stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "I'm going to call in some experts from the state. Maybe they can make sense of this." But I knew, deep in my bones, that no expert was going to have answers for us. This was something beyond their understanding, something that shouldn't exist in this day and age. As the weeks wore on, fear settled over the ranch like a heavy fog. My hands, Luis and Jake, started carrying rifles even for the most mundane tasks. The cattle were nervous, huddling together in the middle of the pastures instead of grazing. Even the dogs seemed on edge, growling at shadows and refusing to stray far from the house. It was Luis who first suggested what we were all thinking but afraid to say out loud. "Jefe," he said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains. My abuela used to tell stories about creatures in the old country, beasts that walked like men but weren't men. She called them El Hombre Lobo, the wolfman. I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't. The tracks that were almost human but too large, the incredible strength it would take to tear apart a full-grown steer, the intelligence it showed in evading us. It all added up to something that defied rational explanation. The state experts came and went, leaving behind a lot of big words and scientific theories, but no real answers. They set up trail cameras and took plaster casts of the tracks, but in the end, all they could say was that we were dealing with an unidentified large predator. As if we needed experts to tell us that. It was about a month into the attacks that I decided to take matters into my own hands. I'd lost nearly a quarter of my herd by then, and the bank was starting to make noise about my loans. If this kept up, I'd lose everything my family had spent generations building. I sent Luis and Jake into town, telling them to take a few days off. Once they were gone, I loaded up my rifle, packed some supplies, and headed out to the far pasture where most of the attacks had been happening. I was going to end this, one way or another. I set up in an old hunting blind on the edge of the woods, my rifle across my knees and a thermos of coffee by my side. As the sun set and darkness crept across the land, I settled in for a long night. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting a pale light over the pasture. The cattle were restless, huddled together and letting out the occasional nervous low. Every sound, every shadow had me on edge, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. It was well past midnight when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The cattle went silent, their fear palpable even from a distance. I raised my rifle, scanning the tree line. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I saw them, two eyes gleaming in the darkness. They were set too high to be a normal wolf or mountain lion, and the intelligence I saw in them sent a chill down my spine. Slowly, the creature emerged from the shadows. Even prepared as I thought I was, the sight of it nearly stopped my heart. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of wolf and man. Thick, matted fur covered its muscular frame, and its hands, if you could call them that, ended in wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was elongated, like a wolf's muzzle, but with an expression of cunning that was terrifyingly human. And those eyes, they swept across the pasture with predatory intent. But there was something else there. Something that spoke of an intelligence far beyond that of a mere animal. I raised my rifle, trying to steady my shaking hands. The creature's head snapped in my direction, those glowing eyes locking onto my position with unerring accuracy. It let out a howl that shook me to my very core, a sound of primal hunger and rage. I fired, the blast of the rifle deafening in the quiet night. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it charged, covering the distance between us with impossible speed. Time seemed to slow. I worked the bolt, chambering another round. Fired again, and again. The creature was almost upon me, its hot breath washing over me as it raised one massive, clawed hand. My last shot caught it square in the chest. It let out a roar of pain and anger, stumbling back. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something there that I'll never forget. A look of almost human frustration and rage. Then it turned and loped back into the forest, leaving behind a trail of dark blood that gleamed in the moonlight. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding, ears ringing from the gunshots. As the adrenaline faded, I began to shake, the full weight of what had just happened crashing down on me. When dawn broke, I went to examine the site of our confrontation. The ground was torn up, deep claw marks gouged into the earth, and there was blood, a lot of it leading off into the woods. I thought about following the trail, about finishing what I'd started, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was a deeper understanding that some things are better left alone. The attacks stopped after that night. Whatever I'd encountered, it had apparently decided that my ranch was no longer easy prey. But the peace I felt was uneasy, tempered by the knowledge that it was still out there, somewhere in the wild places of the world. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I made changes, higher, stronger fences, more lights around the pastures, and I never go out at night without my rifle close at hand. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls across the prairie, I find myself standing on the porch, staring out into the darkness, and I wonder, is it still out there, watching, waiting? I don't have answers. But I do know this: the world is a bigger, stranger place than most people realize. There are things out there in the wild places, things that defy explanation. And sometimes, when the moon is high and the night is dark, they come down from the hills to hunt. So if you ever find yourself out on the prairie on a moonless night, and you hear a howl that doesn't sound quite right, that sends a primal chill down your spine, don't dismiss it. Because out there, in the vast expanses of the wild, the line between predator and prey is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes, just sometimes, we're not the ones at the top of the food chain.